this one's live as well. So as I said when the recorder was off, I'm going to read a short statement and then ask your permission, and then we'll get started. So today is Thursday, October 31st, 2013. My name is Philip Scarpino. I'm the Director of Oral History for the Tobias Center for Leadership Excellence at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. I have the privilege to be interviewing Dr. Alice Eagly. I'm conducting this interview on behalf of the International Leadership Association and the Tobias Center for Leadership Excellence because Dr. Eagly is a recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Leadership Association. We're in a suite at the Fairmont, the Queen Elizabeth Hotel, Montreal, Canada. Both of us are attending the ILA annual meeting. We'll place a more elaborate biographical statement with the interview and transcript, so at this point I'll just mention a few of the highlights of Dr. Eagly's career. She received her PhD in social psychology from the University of Michigan in 1965, MA in psychology from the University of Michigan in 1963, AB in social relations from Radcliffe College in 1960. After earning her PhD, she held faculty positions at Michigan State University, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Purdue University, and she is presently the James Padilla Chair of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Psychology at Northwestern University. Dr. Eagly has had a long and distinguished career as a scholar with interests in the psychology of attitudes and the psychology of gender, which ultimately led to her impressive body of work on leadership. Her publication record is both extensive and impressive. She has published several books, numerous book chapters, and her citation index to her articles lists 273 entries. We'll be talking about many of her publications during the course of the upcoming interview, so one way to summarize the significance and impact of the body of her scholarship is to note that she has 41,131 lifetime citations of her work, with more than 20,000 since 2008. She's the recipient of many honors and awards, a sampling of which includes Honorary Doctorate from Erasmus University, Rotterdam 2012, Honorary Doctorate from the University of Bern, Switzerland 2011. She's the winner of the 2009 Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association, winner of 2008 Distinguished Publication Award from the Association for Women in Psychology for Eagly and Carley Through the Labyrinth, The Truth About How Women Become Leaders. She's the winner of the 2008 Gold Medal from the American Psychological Foundation of the American Psychological Association for Lifetime Achievement in the Science of Psychology, and she is the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Leadership Association. So, I'd like to ask your permission to record this interview, to have the interview transcribed, and then to deposit the recording and transcription in the IUPUI Special Collection and Archives, where it may be used by patrons, including the posting of all or part of the recording or transcript to the website of the IUPUI Special Collections and Archives. And we'd also like to deposit the recording and transcription with the International Leadership Association and the Tobias Center, where once again they may be posted to their websites. So are you all right with that?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. And I hope that I did some justice to your career with that statement.
Nice.
But
yes, you did.
Okay. So I want to, like I said when the recording was off, I want to start with some really simple questions and then get a little bit more elaborate. So,
sure.
So when and where were you born?
I was born in 1938 in Los Angeles, California.
And where did you grow up?
Well, we lived a number of places in Los Angeles area, and then in Oakland, California, and in Long Beach, California after that. And then when I was 11 years old, we moved to Seattle, Washington. So I grew up on the West Coast, but several places.
Huge climate shift from Los Angeles to Seattle.
Yes, it was. Right. Much cooler, much cloudier.
What was your family doing in Los Angeles?
Well, my family had moved there. My parents had moved there in the Depression. And they had come from Seattle. And my father was an engineer, a mechanical engineer. And they moved to Los Angeles for his work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was not a time when there were lots of jobs around, and I think it was a livelier economy in LA. It was an expanding area. And so that's why we were there. It was a very different place then than it is now. Very much smaller.
Less traffic?
Very much smaller, yes.
Do you have any brothers and sisters?
I do. I have a brother who's 3 years older than me. He passed away a few years ago.
And who were your parents? What were their names?
Okay, my father was Harold Hendrickson,
Mm-hmm.
and my mother was Josera Wires Hendrickson.
And you said your father was an engineer. What did your mother do?
My mother, during my childhood and teen years, was a homemaker. She was a stay-at-home homemaker, but she had been, working in office positions before she had her first child, and consistent with what women did in those days, if they possibly could, she stayed home with her children for many years. And then after I went to college only did she go back, and she worked for the city of Seattle, and, took some courses in this and that, and actually, did very well in her work in those years.
So I'm going to ask you a more complicated question now. Either this is going to work or it isn't, so we'll see what happens. All right, so, and I'll set this up for the benefit of anybody using the recording or reading the transcript. So in October 2011, I had the pleasure of interviewing Manfred Ketz-de-Vries in London. And in prepping for that, I read an article that he published in 1994 titled The Leadership Mystique. And something that he said in that article struck me, and I asked him about it, and then I've asked other people that I've interviewed since then. So this is what Ketz-de-Vries said. He said, all of us possess some kind of inner theater and are strongly motivated by a specific inner script. Over time, through interactions with caretakers, teachers, and other influential people, this inner theater develops. Our inner theater, in which the patterns that underlie our character come into play, influence our behavior throughout our lives, and plays an essential role in the molding of leaders. So here's the question. Using his term, inner theater, can you tell me about your own inner theater?
My own inner theater, oh my. Yeah, that sounds so thematic. I don't think my life was that thematic. I think partly being a woman of my generation, there are many uncertainties about career, whether I would be able to have one, what would I do? And so it wasn't that I grabbed hold of some theme when I was 18 years old or something, but I was always a very good student, and I was, kind of joyfully studious. I liked learning. And so in school, I was a very good student. I graduated at the top of my high school class, and then I went off to Radcliffe College, which is, it was only somewhat separated as a women's college from Harvard, in that it was academically integrated. And so that was a very exciting place to be, because there were, it was a place where ideas were always in the air, and there were many famous faculty who were wonderful to listen to in the lectures. That's kind of how we did it those days. They gave lectures and we listened. And so there, although I originally had thought I would be, in chemistry actually, but that was a very unformed idea in high school, because I kind of like science, We didn't have social.
We all have them in high school.
Yeah, we didn't have social science. We had history,
right?
And we had kind of social studies, which was sort of American government, but we didn't have anything like the social science that I became exposed to in university. And so I majored in a field of, they called it social relations. It was an integrated social science major with social and clinical psychology and sociology and social anthropology. And so I found that all immensely exciting.
And how did you identify that as a major?
Well, I kind of fell into it after I decided that chemistry wasn't that interesting. And there might have been a bit of gender threat there too. There were, hardly any women
in chemistry.
Yeah. And then I thought, well, I would study psychology, which was, at that time at Harvard, they had the psychology department like Skinner in one department, and then they had the social psychology and clinical psychology and the social relations. So I figured out that that part, linked to the other social sciences, would be more interesting. They seemed to be in the psychology department running rats or something, which seemed less interesting. Again, that was a sort of a naive decision. I was very young then, but I was pleased then when I got into this social science type major because of the breadth of it, you know. Okay. And so I again was very studious and did very well. After, initially I was insecure because I came from a public high school in Seattle, and lots of these
private school
came from the best private schools in the East.
So
but anyway,
as you went to Harvard then, were you confronted by issues of both class and gender?
Well, yes, there were, there was a set of classmates from very wealthy families for sure, wealthy and famous families, but there were a lot of middle class, students. But the gender issue was not that good for women because this was before Harvard and Radcliffe became integrated, and they have to admit equally now. But at that point, I think we were about 10% of the student body, so we were a minority. Mm-hmm. Remember in some of the first classes they sat us at a special section.
Really?
Yes. But that was only one or two classes. But so it wasn't what we would consider, being in a minority status is not a good thing for one's confidence. But
so that would roughly be the equivalent of admitting, say, African Americans or Asians, and then make them sit on the right side of the room or something.
Yes. But I think it was only one or two classes.
I want to back you up and ask.
Odd separation, yeah.
Just to make sure that I've done this, when you were, high school age, middle school age, were there any individuals or experiences that were really played a role in shaping the adult you later became?
Oh, I don't know. My father, an engineer, mechanical engineer, had become a professor at the University of Washington in engineering. Even though he didn't have a PhD, but faculty in engineering those days usually didn't. Mm-hmm. And so I had a lot of exposure to the university. In Seattle, we lived in the part of the city near the university. He was a professor there. And so I think ultimately having an academic career, at least I sort of knew about them. Mm-hmm. Even though there weren't that many women in them then. But there wasn't a person, I guess. I had some good teachers whom I valued, but no, there wasn't. And the women, I knew, and in the family and family friends, they'd all, if they'd married, all had traditional lives, staying home with children, actually.
So that was the next thing I wanted to ask you. You described yourself as joyfully studious,
yes.
Which is a really wonderful phrase, but there were lots of young women who were joyfully studious, but not so many who achieved what you did. So how do you think you made that transition from joyfully studious to professional academic?
Right. Well, even in high school, I had the idea that I wanted to have a career, but it wasn't clear how I would do that. I had no formed ideas. And so going off to college, I had the idea still I wanted to distinguish myself or do something meaningful somehow. And then again, I was very studious, and so I graduated at the top of my class from Harvard and Radcliffe. The women were higher than the men, actually. And so that was kind of unexpected. I didn't expect to do that well, but again, I was very engaged in the intellectual side of things.
Did your mother encourage you to think in terms of a career?
Sort of, yeah. She was very welcoming of the idea, yes. Although she had had a traditional life, yeah. And my father, yes, but he I remember at one point he encouraged me to go to the University of Washington library and meet the librarians whom he had known as a professor, because he basically thought that would be a nice career for me, which, you know, it could have been, but not the kind of really exciting career I've had. So that was interesting, yeah.
Do you think it's possible that on the one hand your parents recognized how smart their daughter was, but on the other hand they just didn't know what to do about it?
Well, I think they were basically very supportive, and you know, they did pay a fair amount of, although the, you know, college expenses were so much lower then, but they did, you know, they were willing to pay some of, you know, I got a National Merit Scholar, but those never came with much money, no, National Merit Scholarship, but they said okay, and were happy to have me go off to the East. Yeah. So then my ideas, you know, they were sort of formed in college. I was in what I considered a very exciting major. I loved the social sciences. I didn't know if I went to graduate school exactly what it should be in, but then I somehow decided that social psychology was sort of at the center of a lot of things, which is correct, actually.
So you discovered social psychology after you got to college?
Yes.
And when you went to Radcliffe, did you really know very much about graduate school?
Well,
you know it was possible,
only that I lived near a university and my father was a professor, and so I knew that people got graduate degrees and all. And so I thought, again, I was very studious and very, and I thought, well, yeah, I probably should go to graduate school, and presumably that would lead to an academic career, although, you know, it was still a very tentative era for women, because I would have started graduate school in 1961, and in the 50s women were more or less not allowed in the academy.
In psychology?
Yeah, in any field, they were more or less not given faculty positions.
I mean, my area
There's some.
is environmental history, and most of the female scientists in that period gave up everything to be an academic.
Yes.
No family, no children, no.
Right.
You know, they just,
or there was that, but there were very few. I remember when even I was a graduate student, there was one female professor in social psychology. I'd only had one woman professor in my whole undergraduate work. One.
Do you remember her name?
Cecilia Payne-Kapashkin, professor of astronomy. She was very distinguished in her day. Yeah.
I want to ask you kind of a general question and sort of move through. And we'll,
Sure.
Again, this is one of these things that either will work or it won't. But because you're being recognized by the International Leadership Association, I want to ask you a question about leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we move forward today and Saturday, we're going to talk quite a bit about your career and your scholarship. So right now, I want to say to anybody who listens to this recording that each of the topics I'm about to mention we're going to cover in more detail later on. So don't be frightened. But from the time, and I'm going to set this up. From the time you entered graduate school, you were blazing a path as a leader in your field. You earned a PhD in social psychology from the University of Michigan in 1965 at a time when few women were in the field. As a tenured but still relatively young scholar, you turned your attention to issues related to gender and sex roles, and one of the upshots of your work was to bring those subjects into the mainstream of your field. While at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, you brought your young children to work with you, something that was not common at the time, and in so doing made a statement about being a woman and a scholar. You're a trailblazer in your field using meta-analysis and social role theory and applying those things to gender and sex roles, producing cutting-edge work. You bridged from gender and sex roles to leadership and became an internationally respected scholar in all of those areas. So I actually realize I've underplayed what you did, but I needed to be brief. But here's my point, and here's my question. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, from my opinion, you became a leader in your field and an advocate for women in your profession and in the academy. Did you set out to do that? Did you set out to become a leader in your field? Was that a goal?
I set out to do as well as I could. I did not know. I hoped to be successful, but I didn't have the confidence that I necessarily would be.
Where do you think that came from? I'm still trying to figure this out. I mean, this was at a time when there were not a lot of female role models.
Right, there were very few.
Where do you think that idea came from? That I'm just going to be as successful as I can and go as far as I can?
Well, one of the things that would characterize my career, at least I look back on it, is that I didn't necessarily follow the crowd in terms of what topic was most popular or seen as most important at any one point in time. And I sort of followed my interests. So I studied both attitudes and gender when they were unfashionable. Attitudes in social psychology has always been a key issue, but when I did my major work, it was a period when it was rather unfashionable, actually. And my colleague and I, Shelley Chaikin and I, sort of wrote this book, The Psychology of Attitudes, which was a big scholarly book that kind of helped bring it up again. And then when I started studying gender, it was not at all fashionable. It was sort of, nobody does that. Maybe there's some activists out there, writing in magazines or something. But I thought, well, what could be more important to human life? And aren't we social psychologists? And, maybe we should engage this. So that was good too, because
Did you ever feel like a risk taker?
Well,
I'm thinking about earning tenure here.
Well, actually, I got tenure on my work on attitudes,
Yeah.
and that's mainstream, even though it was a little unfashionable then. But then I had tenure when I just really started my work on gender, and it was that some people might say, "Oh, nobody." I remember one person said to me, "Oh, nobody good does that, or nobody good studies that," and so it was.
Someone said that to you.
Yes. And so I thought, it didn't bother me.
You didn't think, I'll show you?
Well,
because you did, of course.
It was sort of, I took it as an unkind comment, and I sort of made me pause, but I went ahead kind of oblivious, which turned out to be a good thing, because then you're not dealing with this ground has already been plowed 100 times, And furthermore, if you work in the currently most popular topic, it's a very competitive ground, because a lot of very good people flock there. And so this way, I was able to make a contribution that turned out to be more important, because it was early, they want to cite the first papers on X, Y, and Z, but, they turned out to be important, and I didn't know how it would all turn out, because you could take a risk like that of studying something that's not fashionable, and it never becomes fashionable. But I did it in a little bit of an oblivious way, I think, not in a very strategic way, but just following my interests, but formed in my education, which was at, in this broad interdisciplinary major, and then at the University of Michigan. At that time, it was an interdisciplinary program in social psychology that was sponsored by psychology and sociology. So that was broad too. And so I was one of these broader topics. The study of attitudes is very rich in social psychology. It has many aspects and goes over into sociology and political science and whatever. And similarly, gender is an immensely interdisciplinary topic. And so I loved the intellectual side of it. This is great. I've had to learn more biology too, and so it was the kind of excitement of it. While I could have, run distance experiments or something, which had that insider excitement with a lot of people competing there about those experiments. But it's what I did. I found more engaging. These sort of broader topics that didn't happen to be fashionable, and as a result, I became a leader. But it's not because I was striving to be a leader.
So let me circle back again. Do you now think of yourself as a leader?
I do, in an intellectual sense, yes. And because my work is cited and my theoretical contributions are used by others, and so yes, that would be the case, yeah. But it wasn't a goal, like a literal goal of mine to do that. It was it was more to figure these things out and to do this work, and very gratifying that people have found it useful, this work, and use it in their work. That's extremely gratifying.
So, thinking of yourself as a leader, does that burden you to live up to it, or liberate you, or both?
Well, being an intellectual leader is not like being a political leader or other kinds of leaders where you have to go out and sort of influence people. Your influence is kind of because you do this work, mainly this writing, and that you become a leader. So it doesn't have the kind of like managerial engagement,
right.
where there is some, like I spent some time a few years as department chair, that sort of thing. So I was a middle manager for a while, but that's not my life work. And so being an intellectual leader, yes, you give talks here and there, but it's not the kind of leadership that people typically study. Scholars of leadership study management and political leadership mainly, rather than intellectual leadership.
So when were you department chair?
Oh, I was department chair. When did that start? About 7 years ago. I ended up doing it for 4 years. 8 years ago. Yeah. Right, that's about it. 8 years ago. I did it for 1 year. It was an emergency in my department. The chair had resigned.
This is at Northwestern.
Yeah, and then I had a year's leave, and then I came back for a regular term, which is 3 years.
How did the academy do in terms of dealing with a woman as department chair?
Oh, it's not uncommon anymore,
No.
actually.
I know that, but I mean it's.
But I was the first female chair of that department. But I know from some other work I've put in a paper recently, that in psychology, about 35% of department chairs, estimated by the APA, are women. That's doctoral granting department. So it's not all that unusual anymore. It's become much more usual. And in my university, there are quite a few women who are chairs,
And was that the first time you held an administrative leadership position?
First time a chair. My others had been more low level, like head of the social psychology area or something, which is just sort of administrative. There's not a larger leadership component,
Have you thought of yourself as an advocate for women in your field?
Yes, that's important to me. Yeah.
In what way? In what way is it important?
Well, I think when I started out, this was in the 60s in my career, it was kind of a complicated era in that certainly opportunities were opening up for women in a kind of a sudden way, actually. But still there was some resistance and some degree of discrimination, although it was very mixed. On the one hand, sometimes in the more progressive places, they were very welcoming of women and might set them ahead to do certain kinds of things, actually, because we need a woman,
Right.
But on the other hand, there was still some resistance here and there. So, and then there was that minority. So, when my first job at Michigan State, there was it's a huge department, still is, no doubt. So how many faculty would have been? I don't know, 40 or something. And there were 2 women besides me, but one was never seen and was unusual in various ways. Only came in at night to teach a course.
Oh.
And so she was not a role. Then there was a clinical psychologist who had a good career,
Mm-hmm.
a more senior woman. But it did feel uncomfortable, like walking into the department meeting. There was one young woman, that was me. And then there was the woman who was never seen. And there was this
So in a department of around 40, there was a mysterious, unseen woman, and then one who was actually there and present for duty, in you.
Yeah, and so that's not a good
Yeah.
situation, we all know. Something that some minorities might face today,
Right.
African American minorities in departments still, but it's sort of uncomfortable because you're kind of under scrutiny. But, it was mixed. People were reasonably kind, and the men were reasonably kind. So it went on. But then, yes, I think I was a role model to a number of women, particularly since then I went ahead and had children, one even pre-tenure. Tenure was easier those days. It was the great expansion of American universities. I don't know if today...
Not the 100-page dossiers and so on.
Yeah, now, they have to have a much bigger record. Of course, people publish more, for various reasons. We didn't even have word processing or anything. Everything was so slow back then. But I don't know if I would think it's a good idea now, but I did, and then I had another child later. And so I think some women were pleased at that, who themselves wished to have children, and then did, and then that I went on and became successful. There were just a little, in my cohort, there's just a few of us in social psychology who published a fair amount and became visible.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a handful of us, yeah. And so I think we were collectively positive for the women, sort of the breakthrough women.
So did you advocate for each other?
Well, I don't know if directly. If we had chance to be supportive of one another, we were. And I still am of colleagues, if I'm asked to write for them for some award or whatever. Within the university, there are various ways. When I was at the University of Massachusetts, I was part of a salary study committee. That was an era when there were a lot of salary studies, where there was the presumption of wage discrimination, and then the university would set up a committee, and then they would, among us would be somebody with good statistical skills. I have reasonable, but that we'd have like somebody else who would run all the data, and then we would do multiple regression equations, and we would so I was advocating for that before the university set it up, actually.
And so did you discover that women's salaries were out of line with the men?
There were adjustments,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So I think that the general conclusion was there was some degree of inequity, and the university wished to remedy it, and they set up they did the right thing, in other words. But I was part of the initiative to do that. So there are things you could, and at Northwestern I've been part, not at the moment, but a few years ago, an initiative to get the university to attend to child care, because it was, most universities do something like on campus or
Right.
whatever nearby. It's pretty routine, but Northwestern had not, which was quite shocking to me because, and I even produced evidence about everybody else was. And the university was very resistant, but then finally they've done some things, not as much as I would hope they would ultimately do. But so that's to support women, to support the women and men, the people with families, but
Right.
So I've been part of local initiatives that are important to these success of women. And also, if you have like on-campus childcare, the students can see that men and women have children.
Right.
And
You don't live in your office.
they're sort of, doing it. And these are our women professors, and they seem to be going along. So I think in terms of opening up the kind of the young women's horizons, to have more models than they may have
Do you
been.
see that as part of your mission to open up the young women's horizons?
Sure, right. Yeah, that's part of being a feminist. You want gender equality, so then we have to have some change so that women are less likely to drop out of the labor force. And I can see ways that they would not necessarily do that and could be able to continue their careers, because many of them are, they're fantastically talented and capable of doing so much with their lives, but if they make just conventional choices, then that usually sets them way back. And so, to let them evaluate that carefully. Yeah.
When you entered the field of social psychology, there were not very many women in that field, and you have had a large number of doctoral students. Do you go out of your way to encourage women to come into the field? And
we have no
them
problem with women in the field now. The psychology PhDs are something like 75% women now. And so that was a gradual
Why do you think
shift.
that is?
Well, there are more women every place, but psychology has had a steeper trajectory than other fields. And I think, women are often interested in human relationships, and it's a very engaging field. So women are choosing it over some other science fields, like, I guess. But, so encouraging other women, you don't have to differentially encourage. We're needing to maybe start to reverse by encouraging more men.
Now, there must have been a period, though, when
Yes.
you became a professional, when there were not so many women.
That's true, but it's not. Wasn't that it? When I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan in the social psychology program, I was not by any means the only woman. I think it was about a third women even then. But University of Michigan's always been a kind of progressive place, and so we were not so few in the program. There were very few faculty, in the university who were women, but that did change then. And so then the graduate programs always had women, just now they're majority women, also in social psychology. So, yes, of course I've been supportive to the women, but I've always enjoyed having male students too.
And I talked to some of them.
The number of male students. Yeah.
In fact, one of them, I'll talk more about this later, one of them told me that every time he helps a student, he feels he's saying thank you to you for what you did for him.
Oh, that's very kind.
I thought it was quite nice, actually.
Yeah.
So, outside of the academy, do you think of yourself as an advocate for women more generally?
Well, I think in my work on gender, yes, particularly having worked on leadership, which is, one of the areas, if we ever have gender equality, we have to have more equality in leadership, obviously. So, particularly in that area, where I've done a bit of writing that's more accessible, like the book Through the Labyrinth is not exactly a trade book, but it's kind of a crossover book. And then that article that I wrote with Linda Carley in the Harvard Business Review turned out to be immensely popular. It kept selling for them, for a long time. So in that sense, there's been a bit of outreach. And I would hope to continue that, because I think to the extent people understand gender in a more adequate or complex way, then people can make better decisions about it, or if to the extent we're committed to gender equality, we could figure out how to do it better.
Do you think that as a society we're committed to gender equality?
Not universally by any means. No, it's a topic on which people, Americans, Canadians too, I presume, differ, because there's certainly conservative elements of society where the traditional family arrangements, traditional division of labor is valued, and then there's a lot of people who are committed to think gender equality would be a very good idea. Think having more women leaders would be a good idea. Particularly in the U.S. recently, where we had this debacle with the closing of the government.
Well, that's where I was going to go with this.
Okay.
Is you see the mess that we have in our own federal government in the United States. What reflections does that cause you to have on the subject of gender equality and women as leaders?
Well, there was some very good publicity with the debacle of closing down the government, because the efforts that sort of led to the accord that got our government back came from female senators, Senator Collins, and then some of the other women who were meeting together. The women senators, there are 20 now, they're meeting together, and that's great because it's across party lines, because although they're majority Democrats, they're not all Democrats.
Right.
And so they then exerted some leadership to kind of be more cooperative, bring things together, and they got very good press out of this, for sure. And so I don't believe that women are sort of inherently more cooperative, or that pattern would always be present, but in those circumstances, they certainly exerted a positive role. And I think women would in many ways. I do think it would be a better government or a better world if women were 50% of the leaders, for sure.
So as a woman who's spent most of her adult life studying attitudes and gender and then leadership and so on, and then you look at our government and you see a leader like, say, Michelle Bachmann, how do you respond to that?
Well, there's diversity in female leaders, for sure. And so she and Sarah Palin are so interesting because they're on the right, which is less usual for women. But both of them are, very assertive. And so on the one hand, since one of the issues for women is often being sufficiently assertive, being charismatic, sort of being out there, because women are taught to be modest, right, and nice. And so that's one of the issues for young women. Often, if they do want to be, they have to learn how to do that. And so having those women on the right in one way is quite wonderful, because you see them, they're really out there. But they're not the traditional value pattern. So we know that women tend to lean to the left, and they tend to have more sort of benevolent and socially compassionate attitudes as a group than men. And so they're sort of going against the grain in terms of attitudes. But that's okay. I think there is a pretty powerful presence on the right in the U.S., and I think it's better that some of them are women than not. So yeah, it's very interesting. It was so interesting, with Sarah Palin and then Hillary Clinton and all that, with the prior round of presidential politics. It would be wonderful to see how it plays out this time.
Certainly will. I'm gonna switch to a more chronological approach.
Sure.
And some of the things we've talked about, your high school and so on, but you mentioned at one point that when you were in high school, you had an interest in chemistry.
I did, just because I liked science.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I liked the idea of science and hypotheses and quantification. It was the only model where I took science and I took chemistry and physics. And my father was an engineer, so, there was that model. But it wasn't very deep, I must say. It wasn't a deep sort of interest. I thought, well, I'll be a scientist. What kind of a scientist? Oh, Chemistry seemed interesting, so it wasn't very deep.
I mean, I normally wouldn't say much about myself in one of these interviews, but I was in high school in the 1960s, and there were lots of high school young women and chemistry and physics and so on. But when you were in high school, was that common? Did young girls take chemistry or physics?
Well, yes, some. I remember when we had 3 semesters of each of those. So when I took the 3rd semester of physics, there were only about 3 of us, but it was fine. And
there's a huge attrition in physics anyhow.
Yeah. There was the 4th year of math. It was interesting. There were only 2 of us in the class. So girls tended to drop out of math. They don't anymore, but they did then. And so that was all right. But it was, setting myself apart from kind of the mainstream of teenage girls, for sure.
Did you know you were doing that?
I guess I did, but...
I mean, I don't know much about being a teenage girl, but my sense is that many of them don't. I raised one, but I mean, they don't actively seek to set themselves apart.
No, I didn't. But I liked those subjects. I liked all my subjects, though. So it was. I suppose it was somewhat isolating. But the boys were not. They weren't unkind. They were fine about it.
When you looked around you when you were in high school and realized who the scientists were, did you ever think that there were limited options for a girl?
Well, I didn't know how I would do it, but I didn't worry about that much. I remember telling, in a sort of a joking way, well, maybe I'll have a chemistry lab in my basement, something like that. But I was just joking, but I look back on that, seeing that I definitely didn't have it worked out. I didn't tell this boy, I think he was asking me well, I'll be a professor of chemistry, obviously, at a top university. That would never have occurred to me.
When you looked around you when you were young, or before you went off to college, did you ever conclude that there were limited choices available to a young woman, or did you see the world that way, or did you see it differently?
I didn't worry about it, but I did have the conventional desire to get married and have children, that's for sure. It wasn't that I saw myself just in terms of career, but I hoped to have a career. And I didn't know about having young children and the career, whether that would be allowable or doable. I remember thinking a bit about that. Yeah.
But ultimately you did, and you took your children to work and so on and so forth.
I didn't understand when I was young the costs of dropout would be immense. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you get in the career and you see what people are doing and they're going stepwise and getting tenure, I knew that it would be disastrous. Mm-hmm. To say, oh well, I'll take a several-year vacation and come back. You wouldn't be you would lose your job, and so it just wasn't an option. Yeah.
So you went to Radcliffe, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you why. I mean, you must have had lots of choices with it being an excellent student in high school, and why?
I went to Radcliffe because my brother went to Harvard. That's quite simple.
Okay.
He was.
And was he there? Was there an overlap?
Yes, of 1 year. He went on one of those naval scholarships, naval ROTC scholarships, mm-hmm. And he did go. He had to go into the Navy after that, and so. Therefore, I had the idea, the concept, and I thought, well, my brother got to go to Harvard. Maybe I should go to Harvard, but I also applied to a number of other places, including a couple of women's colleges like Wellesley. Hmm. And my brother said I should go to Wellesley. That's how conventional he was.
I mean, I've occasionally had people just tell me, well, I just picked it because it was the farthest from home, or,
No, it was. I probably wouldn't have made that decision had my brother not been in Harvard. I might not have had the concept. And And then I decided, I thought, well, maybe I should go to Wellesley then. But that was the convention, like the girls he dated were at
Right.
Wellesley.
Oh, so that's how we do it.
well, and that was the more, he actually was rather conventional and conservative in his ideas throughout his life, and we came from the same family. But then I thought, well, no, I should go to the place that has all the famous professors.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did, yeah.
But you knew that. You knew that the famous professors were there.
You bet I did.
Who stands out as you look back?
Oh, they had a bunch of people there in the social sciences. The person I did my undergraduate thesis with, Herbert Kellman, someone I've sort of had a lifetime association with, but there were a number of people in Thomas Pettigrew in social psychology. There was the famous Talcott Parsons in sociology, and the famous Clyde Placone in anthropology.
Did you work with Parsons?
No, but I took a course.
Mm-hmm.
And there were, a number of, Gordon Allport in psychology was very
Did you
famous.
have a course from Allport?
I had a course and a tutorial, they called them tutorials, small
Mm-hmm.
group thing, on the psychology of religion. We read William James.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there were a number of very famous social scientists, psychologists there. And so I knew it was by far the better faculty. And Radcliffe had the reputation, as my brother had picked, sort of like the intellectual women, some of whom were odd and that sort of thing. So right.
Any of your classmates who went on to famous careers that people would have heard of?
Well, at Harvard there are, but our Radcliffe classmates. There's one very well-known historian. I don't know, you're a historian. Did you? She's an American history. She just died. Pauline Rebelke Meyer.
Yes.
She was a classmate.
Did you know her?
Yes.
Yes.
And I noticed she just passed away recently. Very sad. But so I think of her. There were a few other professors, but there weren't any politicians or. But I'm sure in law and medicine, there for our era there were a lot of very good careers. I know. I don't think we had famous novelists.
So a couple of the people that I talked to you about, and I asked each one of them, what would you ask Alice Eagly if you were going to interview her?
Mm-hmm.
And each one, I don't think they talked to each other. Each one of them said, ask her what inspired her when she was at Radcliffe.
Oh, yeah.
So can you answer that question? What inspired her?
Sure. The glory, the glory of really the social sciences. I thought it was so fascinating. I thought everything was pretty fascinating, but, and then, it was a situation in which there were very many intellectual women because we were segregated in our housing, as I guess most universities were. So
I think they were all ruthlessly segregated in those days.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we lived in these dormitories with these other women, and they were highly selected, and many of them were extremely intellectual. So it was okay, to discuss ideas and discuss what we learned. We all had dinner together at a formal sit-down dinner in those days.
In a cafeteria?
No, it was served. But the freshman, year, we took turns waiting on, so to speak. And so, in part, we did the service, but there were also employees. But we had sit-down dinners, and we had coffee in the living room afterwards, bit demitasse. And so we talked to each other in a way that, you know, if it's all cafeteria and more random now, it's rather different. It's that way at Harvard too now.
Right.
But this thing about sitting around to talk, and we often talked about what we were learning, and it was an intellectual, very smart group. And so I think that was good, and kind of affirming for, you know, for having careers. The larger environment, though, since we were this small minority and there were a lot of very conventional men there, was not so affirming. But then I liked what I learned. I liked it all, and then there was a certain feeling of it motivated me to do well in a way, you know, because I saw these other women doing well. The men were not so much in my thinking. Yeah. And so I wanted to go on, and I didn't, in a sense, want to. So many of the women then would marry at the, you know, that was the very conventional. This was the 1960s, so think 1950s. We were in school in the 50s.
Right.
Very conventional era, and so many of them had the model that they would marry by the end of college and then settle down right away and have children, and if they had a career, it was later. And quite a few of the women in my class did that, and some of them then went to law school, medical school, whatever, you know, 10, 15 years later. But yeah, I sort of wanted to keep going. I had the idea that wouldn't be a good idea to, you know, embark on family formation so young.
Did you, I mean, could one reasonably conclude that being there changed your life?
Well, I don't know how it would have gone had I gone to the University of Washington, like most of my high school classmates. They went to the University of Washington. Or one of those colleges in the West. A few went to Stanford, you know, but not too many went east, although two of my classmates did go to Harvard besides me. So it did, because it was success. I did well, and it was inspiring and, you know, intellectually engaging, I guess I have to say, in a big way.
And you graduated at the top of your class?
I did.
Yeah. And I wrote down here in my notes that you academically lit the place up. National Merit Scholar, Phi Beta Kappa ranking senior prize. Graduated at the top of your class. Other than anyone we've talked about, did you encounter anyone else while you were there at Radcliffe or Harvard that really inspired you? You mentioned several people, but...
Well, you know, I was collectively inspired by a lot of my classmates because they were so smart and interesting in various fields. And, you know, Radcliffe itself was a bit odd. They had it didn't have a faculty, you know, it never had one of its own, but there was, it had an administration. So it had a president and deans, no faculty.
The faculty were all at Harvard.
From the very beginning, it never had a faculty. And so the president and deans were persons in our lives. And I remember Radcliffe got a president maybe after the first 2 years I was there. When I was there, it was the old style. The president was a man, some Harvard professor they brought over, you know. But then they hired a woman, I'm blocking on her name, but she was a scientist, I think a biologist of some sort, and she was the first to sort of talk to us about careers, because she had children and a husband, and then a successful career as a scientist and became an administrator. And so she talked about herself as some kind of phrase like a scientist with nest building experience or something. So she referred to her life in that holistic way.
Right.
And she engaged more with the students, invited us over and talked to us about many things. But she was, I think, a kind of a breakthrough in that she did provide a role model of an integrated career and family life, and was willing to bring it to the surface. And that was nice.
So you spent most of your adult life as an advocate for gender equality.
Yes.
Yet you went to a women's college.
Mm-hmm. Well, not an ordinary women's college.
Well, it was kind of a subsidiary of Harvard because they wouldn't let women in there.
Yeah.
So was that the right thing for you at that time?
Yeah, but it wasn't like going to Wellesley. It wasn't like a real women's college. It was a men's college that they let us in the door to. And that was how Radcliffe began, sometime in the 19th century. It was set up as an entity so women could get, so-called man's education. And they brought Harvard professors over to give their lectures a second time to this engaged group of women. So it was always about getting women access to Harvard. And it remained that. It was all about when Yale and Princeton and those schools were closed to women, so in its time it was very progressive. But it was all about Harvard.
So when you graduated in 1960, you spent a year in Norway?
I did.
Why? I mean,
Well,
what attracted you to do that?
It was common if you were a good student to try to get some sort of fellowship.
Right.
For a year, maybe go abroad, and that I'd never been to Europe or anything, so that was a good idea. My father's family was Norwegian.
So that's why you picked Norway?
Well, that was one part of it, and then it happened that there were psychologists there. The professor who I did my honors degree with, Professor Herbert Kellman, he had a fellowship to go there, and then he told me there was this then very famous psychologist who was going to be there that year, by the name of Fritz Heider, who was then very prominent in social psychology. And he was actually older then, but he had published this book that was getting so much attention. And then some other psychologists were sort of gathering there. So I thought, well, it's not a famous place in psychology on its own, but then they have this gathering of several very well-known people.
And so where was this?
In Oslo.
And
University of Oslo.
Okay.
And so, and then there was the ethnic connection.
Mm-hmm.
Some of my father's relatives were, he died about that time, but there was still some contact. It was his father that had emigrated, and his mother.
Right.
So I thought, oh, my Nordic tradition, and then so why not? Yeah.
So.
And then I also applied for something to go to Germany. The German government had, but I didn't know. Besides that, I'd studied German, but I wasn't by any means fluent German. I didn't have any concrete plan. If they gave me this, where would I go in Germany? It was sort of vague, and I think I did get that too, but I didn't have a concrete idea what I would do or why I would go to Germany.
Do you speak any Norwegian?
I learned quite a lot the year I was there.
And what kind of an impact did spending that year, right, university in
Yeah.
Oslo, or academic year?
Yeah, it was not so academic. I went to this seminar with the famous psychologist, but I was just a young person. I didn't speak, and there was actually a Norwegian social psychologist who was at that time sort of rising in prominence, although he sort of didn't continue to really. But
who was
and
that?
so I went to his. Who was that? It was a man by the name of Ragnar Robenveit. And I went to his seminar, which was interesting. It was in Norwegian, and so I was sort of on the edges of understanding. And I ended up marrying one of the other Fulbright scholars. So it was personally significant in that way. And then just the idea of being in a different culture and being abroad, I think, for someone like me who hadn't had that opportunity, it's just enriching in multiple ways to be in and say, oh, they do things differently, don't they? And, I think it's just inevitably for a young person a very good experience to go to a completely different culture, even though it was in my ethnic heritage. But then I understood those relatives better because there's a certain ethnic, stoicism and like inexpressiveness actually in I don't know if all the people in the North, but certainly the Norwegians. And then I understood my father so much better. It wasn't all personality, it was also a culture. He'd probably grown up with that,
right.
That sort of restraint, and he was not an expressive person or a very chatty person at all. And then there was just lots of them like that. So I understood a little bit about. It was personally enlightening to see that. Yeah. So it was a good experience.
After that Fulbright, you entered graduate school at the University
Yes.
of Michigan.
Uh-huh.
Why did you pick Michigan? You must have had lots of options.
Well, there weren't so many social psychology programs back then that were, actually active programs. That was a very different era in psychology. Psychology is much, much, much smaller as a discipline than it is now. And so there were, there was Stanford had a sort of active thing going, and Michigan was really the largest and in many ways the most prominent program. I applied to several. But then one of the key things is the idea of the interdisciplinary program appealed to me. I'd been in this interdisciplinary major. I loved breadth, and so the fact that it was co-sponsored by psychology and sociology was appealing, although it was actually not in its successful period. It sort of fell apart a few years after that, as for reasons having to do with what was happening in the disciplines, particularly in psychology. But so I had I had an idea of what it might bring, which it did only to some extent as a program.
So you were Woodrow Wilson Fellow, National
Yes.
Science Foundation Cooperative Graduate Fellow.
You were mentored by Herbert Kellman and Melvin Manus.
Right.
So Kellman moved up there?
Yes, he had.
Yeah.
He had. It was interesting. He went to Michigan, and then he went back to Harvard. He was invited back a number of years later. But when I was a graduate student, he had moved to Michigan, and so then I ended up working with him again. And then I worked with Melvin Manus also.
Did you go there to work with them, or was that just serendipity?
I didn't know who I'd work with,
Mhm.
and then I liked Herbert Kellman. He was very supportive and had very smart man. And Melvin Manus, they're both very supportive, and it was still that vulnerability, I guess, as a woman, sort of like, could I do this? And even though, I'd always done well, so I should have been confident, but yeah.
I mean, did you ask yourself when you figuratively walked in the door, can I do this?
No, because I had a kind of academic confidence, because I did so well as an undergraduate, but it's sort of like, now I have to do something else. I have to do research. Well, I did a little research as an undergraduate, but you have to do research. I have to develop in other ways, yeah.
Were there very many women on the faculty?
Well, in social psychology, there was one woman professor, Helen Peake, and that was good. We women in the program appreciated that a lot, and her presence. She was a positive presence. And on the larger psychology faculty, I think there were hardly any, but there were women that were, in those uncertain statuses. They would be lecturers or research associates. Yeah.
And that means somebody who's working part-time or not on tenure track.
Yeah, right. And there's still a lot of women doing that in universities, but then, you could see what had happened. Talented woman marries man becomes professor, she becomes research associate.
Right.
There are many famous cases of that, in that but earlier generations, because that was, and some of those women ultimately became professors and got recognized,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes they were working together with their husbands or whatever, but because there was, for one thing, there was the nepotism rule back then, that you couldn't have your spouse be a professor. So, yeah, there weren't a lot of role models, but there was a bit. It wasn't like totally none.
Were there very many women in your graduate entering cohort?
Yes, I think, again, Michigan was pretty progressive, so it might have been around a third. Yeah.
So when you entered the graduate program there, did you in any way think of yourself as a pioneer or trailblazer for women?
No, it was pre-women's movement. It was 1961. The women's movement started in the late 60s. And so it was still the era when I didn't have any real feminist consciousness. There was no vocabulary. I remember one professor, this person, personality, and he's sort of a man, and he sort of brought this up in a very brief way. How I don't know what the topic was, but he was saying it was sort of ridiculous the way women are treated, or something. Sort of early consciousness, and I thought, oh, that's probably true, isn't it? Yes, but there was no discourse on the status of women, except I remember that because it was so unusual. Yeah.
No formal discourse in the classroom. No formal discourse in the literature.
It came in the late 60s. It was sort of like, a surprise to me. And it was very welcome because I was in my young career phase, and it gave a lot of sort of more validation for women having careers, and began to break into this notion that to be a good mother you have to stay home, so there was questioning of all of that. So that was supportive, yeah.
I'm going to mention the names of two of the people that I talked to, whose names you gave me. One of your former students from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the scholarly collaborator, Linda Carley.
Yes.
She described you as extraordinarily hardworking, and your research as careful, exacting, proper, and perfect.
Oh, that's kind.
We're not done yet. And she said, you're the kind of researcher who keeps pushing to make perfect even more perfect.
Oh.
Okay, so then I talked to Blair Johnson, who was one of your students at Purdue, and said that you faced a male-dominated field and thrived, and then he went on to say that he talked about your high standards, your constant striving to make your work as close to perfect as possible. And I don't think they talked to each other, but they used the same words. So here's the question. Did any of the emphasis in your professional career on hard work, high standards, and perfection stem from being one of the few women in your field?
Could have, because you feel you're more vulnerable, maybe. We know that in some research studies, that if you make a mistake, you're more vulnerable. Yeah. Sometimes it was actually difficult because sometimes I was too, perhaps hard on graduate students who weren't with the program sort of being exacting. Linda and Blair were great to work with, but sometimes I could get a bit annoyed, when this was much more difficult, because you have to work so closely with the graduate students on the project. And mostly it was great, but yeah, I guess I did. I was seeing it as having high standards and being demanding. Yeah. And that was good for them, because
Well,
they responded
I would
well.
say for the benefit of hindsight, they did say it was good for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, sometimes it could be a source of some tension with some students. Yeah.
But they both wondered, and it makes sense if your really extraordinarily high standards were really a manifestation of being one of the few women in your field and feeling as though you had to be better.
Well, that's what we sometimes see in research, that there's we talk about the double standard, and I think that may be true to some extent, but again there's all this mix, because when on the one hand there's some desire, because there are so few women, and those who are more liberal about these issues kind of want to push women forward to make sure they have every chance. And then on the other hand, there's this underlying, often, maybe not with the same people, but distrust of whether we're really good enough. So I think it probably contributed to that. Yeah.
In addition to your two mentors, Kelman and Manis at University of Michigan, were there other individuals there who influenced your professional development?
Well, at Michigan, again, I was with a very good group of graduate students. They were important, some of whom have had prominent careers. And so that was good, as they were smart, and so it was good to be with them. Other faculty, it was sort of more remote, that I might have taken I took a course. Michigan had many successful professors because it was one of the major psychology departments, and I enjoyed taking courses in various topics and going to talks and that sort of thing. So there was sort of generally inspiring atmosphere. I remember going to colloquia what we had, and then somebody would get up and give a very nice talk, and I would wonder, could I ever do that, like before an audience like this? Be intimidating.
At what point did you know you could do it?
Well, after I started doing it, I guess. But yeah. So, but intimidating, but inspiring. That there's good people talking about their work in interesting ways. There weren't that many women like who come into the colloquia, but again, there weren't very many women who were prominent in psychology at that time.
While you were a graduate student at the University of Michigan, did you become interested in the emerging women's movement?
Yes, yeah, that was very exciting.
Can you talk about that?
Well, that was in the late 60s. Remember, there was Betty Friedan's book in the late 60s that was so widely read and really quite inspirational. And I did read it. And so it was, creating a lot of public discussion. And so that was great. I read a lot of it, but I sort of figured out that to participate at, like in the public discourse, probably not what I was ready for or could do well. But there was this great void in psychology. There had been very little study of gender.
Why do you think that was?
Because it wasn't in the consciousness of the culture, and so it wasn't in the consciousness of the social scientist. The developmental psychologists had, to some extent, studied, because they studied the family. They couldn't, the mother and father. They couldn't totally avoid it. But the rest of psychology, of course, there was Freud.
Right.
But in terms of academic psychology as we knew it, there was a void, pretty much.
So even though most of the psychologists were men, they didn't study like masculinity or...
No.
That actually came after.
Yeah, no.
Not before.
No, they didn't.
Okay. Was it mostly female scholars who initiated the study of masculinity? Is that a fair question?
Female scholars more studied women and gender, sex differences, not so much focusing on men at all, because the idea was in the movement as it developed within psychology that women had been ignored.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that sex differences had been studied, as they had some, it had all been misconstrued, like Darwin got it wrong and everybody, and early on there was this notion that women were intellectually inferior, and which was widely propagated by psychologists. But that had been sort of tested more in the first women's movement, in the 1920s by a few scholars who were women. But then there was this broader interest that rapidly developed in psychology, actually, about gender and sex differences with various voices, but not the study of masculinity, really. It was men who then distinctively have studied masculinity. And there's some women or male-female teams now, but there's quite a bit of study just on women, and some of it was social issue related, like about family violence and sexual harassment and abortion and rape and that sort of thing. There were social issue topics, and then there were other topics that sort of came naturally, like in social psychology. There had been for a long time work on stereotypes, but it had been about nationality mainly and ethnicity, and so it was like, oh, gender stereotypes, right? Well, we know how to study stereotypes. We can do that. Let's do it.
So is that how it worked for you, that you became interested in stereotypes? There was a body of literature on stereotypes that were not gender related, and you...
Well, I have studied stereotypes. Yeah, that's easy for social psychologists because there was a history. We weren't like starting from nothing. And how could we have ignored gender stereotypes? They're probably the most salient in society, And so, well, because there was no discourse on gender, it remained kind of invisible. And then there are a lot of issues, because it's a historic interest in psychology, around individual differences. So comparing men and women has been forever of great interest to psychologists, and relates to, critical, huge issues like nature and nurture.
Right.
So psychologists forever studied nature and nurture, and with some interest in sex differences, went, back to Darwin, really, and of course Freud coming in from that side, but so that sort of in a general way, it's something that psychologists could grasp hold of that wouldn't be out of the boundaries of the discipline in any way. It's just that it hadn't been done that much in a sort of modern empirical way.
So it would be fair for a person who's not a psychologist to conclude that psychology didn't really take seriously issues of gender and sex differences until there were women in the profession who wished to study it.
Well, till there was a feminist movement that gave people inside and outside psychology some vocabulary and means of having a discourse about it, a way of thinking about it. Earlier it had been kind of simple, with a lot of interest in intellectual qualities. Are women really as smart as men? And then some interest, about the family and that sort of thing in developmental psychology. But to have it be, it really grew. I wrote a paper about this that I published with colleagues fairly recently, where we actually looked at the history of publication. You could do that in the database, the PsycInfo database, and there's just this rapid increase that started. We went back to 1960, where there was just very little, and then it rapidly increased with the women's movement, and then sort of leveled off.
So if the impetus and the vocabulary comes out of feminism and the women's movement, when did you begin to think of yourself as a feminist? I don't mean a particular day, but I mean...
Yeah, well, as soon as the feminist movement developed in the late 60s, I knew that was the right thing, so to speak. So I thought of myself as a feminist, but I hadn't in graduate school, because if you thought about feminists, you thought about the women's suffrage movement or something.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, the earlier movement.
I mean, do you remember at some point thinking, yes, this is right, why didn't I think of this before?
Well, I sort of eased into studying gender because I was studying attitudes and continued to, but then within that, since attitudes are about social influence, in the persuasion attitude change aspect, then I sort of looked at gender in relation to social influence. So it sort of merged. I merged it with my other interest, and then only later did it come out in other ways, such as studying leadership. So it was a gradual. I just knew it was interesting and important, but I didn't have any real framework for studying it, just like the other folks in social psychology. So it took some time before I had some way of thinking about it that would make sense, that would carry forward so that I could branch out. Because initially it was just a subtype of my work on attitudes of persuasion. Fine. But to have it be something on its own right that would have greater scope took me some time to develop a framework.
Would it be reasonable for somebody to conclude, looking at your scholarly career, that before you moved actively into the study of gender, you self-identified as a feminist?
Oh, well, yes. That's true.
Okay. And do you remember, was there anything in particular that inspired you? Or
Oh, there was a huge amount of social unrest and discussion. Those were unsettled times. There was the civil rights movement,
Right.
of course, and then the women's movement coming afterwards. And so, the civil rights movement brought the idea that we could change things. And then the women's movement also. And then there was the war in Vietnam. Those were very difficult days. And so there was a lot of, lots of kinds of discourse, some of it quite radical, and...
Were you involved in that sort of thing on campus?
Not so much, in terms of... I was in various efforts. That was when I was at the University of Massachusetts in the late 60s, like the salary efforts and other efforts. And, some kinds of meetings and talks I went to, but I wasn't spending...
Teach-ins, war protests, anything like that?
I didn't spend a lot of time, doing that. After all, I had a child, I had a baby, and I had to get tenure. So I had to sort of tend to getting some writing and articles out. Yeah. Okay,
so different topic, but related. You married Robert Eagly in 1962. How did you meet? Is that a fair question?
We were Fulbright scholars
Okay.
in Norway. We met on the boat going over. Yeah.
And he became an economist?
He did, yeah.
Professor of economics?
Yes, for a number of years, yeah.
And I understand that when you all moved to Purdue, that he sort of transitioned from an academic career to dad, I guess. Is that a fair question?
Yes, he had some difficulties there at University of Massachusetts and did not end up getting tenure. So that was very hard. And so, he really wanted to move away from there. And so the position at Purdue came up, and he had spent a couple years there in New York at the Federal Reserve Bank. That was very difficult because we were living apart. And so then we both went to Indiana, and he didn't find a regular position. So we did have a role reversal in that he did a lot of the domestic side of things, and we had 2 children by then. And so that was a great support to me. It would have been better had it, another appropriate kind of position worked out for him. That would have been better, but it was very difficult to do that.
So that happened in the context of looking for a position, and wasn't a sort of conscious, let's switch roles.
No, it wasn't what we desired.
Mm-hmm.
We desired to, have a 50-50 arrangement.
So you earned your PhD in 1965. Spent 2 years at Michigan State, which we talked about a little bit, then moved to the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 67,
Mm-hmm.
promoted from assistant to associate to full, and then in 1980 you moved to Purdue, where you stayed until 1995.
Right.
So we're gonna run out of time here in a bit,
Yeah.
but what I want to do, and we'll see if a historian can do this, is I'd like to see if we can pull apart the elements of your research agenda, and then before we go our separate ways on Saturday, to put them back together again.
Okay.
But I'm thinking that many people will use this interview who are really not familiar with your field,
Mm-hmm.
and I would like them to be able to get it,
Mm-hmm.
to see what it is that contributed to the development of Al Eagly as a scholar and a leader. So, I am going to ask you questions about your attitudes, your research on attitudes, about meta-analysis, about gender, sex roles,
Mm-hmm.
and other topics, and then we're going to see if we can put it back together. But
Mm-hmm.
if I miss anything, if you see me headed down
Yeah,
the primrose
okay.
path, for heaven's sakes, tell me, because
Uh-huh.
this is just based on a week's worth of homework and not a lifetime of study. So, so as a doctoral student, and when you became a young faculty member, you concentrated your research on attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
So for the benefit of anybody who's going to listen to this recording or read the transcript, I'm going to read a brief description of your research on attitudes published in the American Psychologist in November of 2000.
Okay.
And so that's their words and not mine. And it says, this, I quote, as a graduate student and young faculty member, Eagly specialized in the study of attitudes by publishing experimental studies of the cognitive processes by which people change attitudes. So, the words are all in English, but they are not necessarily clear for somebody who's not in your field. So maybe you could start, for the benefit of anybody who uses this interview in the future, to explain what you mean by the cognitive process by which people change attitudes. What is it that you were studying?
Oh, yeah. Well, the usual model in those studies was that there's somebody who, there's some kind of message delivered that's intended to be persuasive. They're usually counter-attitudinal, so that it's not something you already agree with. And then people may change or not. And so a psychologist wants to know what goes in between. Is it the identity of the person? Is it something about the content, and how might they process, if the arguments are used, how might those be processed? And so it's obviously complex because there are many ways that happens. And so what I did was probe some of those in terms of theories, of the time. And, I looked at, to some extent, at the at the understanding, the extent to which people are actually in a detailed way using the information that they're getting, or are they sort of doing it a little more heuristically, like they just grab pieces of it. Well, it depends, of course, but and then I looked at what we called attributional processes. Well, why is the person saying that? You know, people have theories about the motivations of the person who's giving the message. So do they have sort of a vested interest in this side of things or not? So if you can't explain it in terms of their vested interest, or maybe even they're kind of moving against what their usual position is, people are more likely to give it credence, actually, which is some of the work that I did. Yeah. So it was also the beginnings of the time when psychologists were interested in sort of two levels of processing, which are sort of more systematic, or using the information very carefully, versus more heuristic, which would be grabbing hold of pieces, like, oh, anything you say is fine, you're an expert, or whatever. And so we were interested in the conditions under which people would process in a more systematic way or a more heuristic way. Sort of there's two levels, and in the heuristic is often more automatic, and people are less aware that they're doing it. Mm-hmm. So we tracked some of those processes in most of that persuasion work. And then I was very much interested in the broader tradition of attitude research, which is quite rich. In the book I wrote with Shelley Shagan on the psychology of attitudes, where we didn't just deal with that body of persuasion research, but much larger body of work.
So, persuasion research deals with how people are persuaded?
Yes.
The mechanisms of persuasion?
Yes, what goes on in their minds when they accept ideas from the outside.
And this is an approach that was using quantitative method?
Oh, yes.
This is not a qualitative research.
No, it's not at all qualitative. No, nothing's qualitative.
Well, once upon a time it was.
Once upon a time, but in academic psychology, there's not that much. So we would have measures, of people's attitudes, and we would try to probe their processes. We often had them, this is semi-qualitative, we had them write down in some of the studies the thoughts they had while listening to the message, and but then we coded those and quantified certain features of them. But that would be a use of a narrative method of getting them to write things down.
So this type of research began for you when you were a doctoral student?
Yes.
And was this because of the people that were mentoring you?
Yeah,
that was
yes.
their field?
Herbert Kellman and Melvin Manus both did some of this kind of research, and it was in mainstream social psychology.
And at that point you saw yourself in the mainstream?
Yep.
Okay. So for the benefit of somebody who's not in your field, can you briefly explain what your dissertation was about?
Oh, it was on something we called involvement as a determinative attitude. So if people really care a lot about the domain versus not, if it's less personally involving, would that affect whether they're persuaded? Yeah. And so I did some experiments on that, that I did a few more. Yeah. So I pursued that theme later because there's actually different sort of subtypes of involvement that make a difference. So one of my meta-analyses was on that. And so, the idea was that whether you're involved, not just affected whether you're persuaded, but the processes that you would use. Yeah.
So you obviously earned your doctoral degree with your dissertation, but the research that you did, looking back on it, would you classify that as cutting edge or mainstream?
Oh, kind of mainstream. Yeah, not so wildly developed. I think we're more demanding now about dissertations too.
I didn't mean that as a criticism of your dissertation.
We make people do several studies. Back then, it was more, you could do sort of one study. Yeah. So
the standards for
were very different,
Yeah.
and it was not like I look back on how glorious my dissertation is. Not really. Yeah.
So I looked at your resume. First couple of articles, Herbert Kelman and Alice Eagly,
Yeah.
Attitudes Toward the Communicator, Perception of Communication, Content and Attitude Change.
Yeah.
Number 2, Alice Eagly and Melvin Manus,
Yeah.
Evaluation of Communicator as a Function of Involvement, Journal of Personality and Psychology, 1966. Those were your doctoral advisors.
Yes.
Was that customary at that time that the doctoral advisor would in fact launch the student by
Yes.
co-authoring?
Yes, that's still the case.
Yeah, and you've done a considerable amount of that.
With my own graduate students,
Yeah.
yes.
So your first book, Samuel Himmelfarb, Alice Eagly, editors,
yeah, it was an
Readings and
edited.
Attitude Change.
And that was an edited book.
Yeah.
And Samuel Himmelfarb was a colleague of mine at the University of Massachusetts.
And what were you trying to accomplish with this edited
Well,
volume?
it was sort of trying to capture this attitudes area at the time, and we wrote, I think, an introductory and a final chapter that we thought were kind of making broader statements about where the field was at that point, and then a number of excellent articles were included. So, yeah. And we thought it would be useful to use in graduate courses in attitudes.
Did that work out?
Yeah.
Was it used in graduate courses?
Yeah.
So, Himmelfarb was a colleague. Was he a senior colleague?
No, he was basically at my stage, yeah.
So you're both relatively junior
Yeah.
faculty, and you're doing this edited book on
Yeah.
the state of your field, so to speak.
Yeah.
Did that ever seem like a risk to you?
No, and Sam, it was Sam's idea,
Mhm.
and I just, helped with it, and it was fine as an early project, yeah.
And we're going to talk about meta-analysis later, but this is pre-meta-analysis.
Oh, it's pre-meta-analysis,
So this is just,
yeah.
you're just sort of soliciting articles from people who can come at this from different perspectives.
Yeah.
And then you provide the context for it.
Right, that's what
Okay.
it was, yeah.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit.
Sure.
And we'll see if we can do this. So, 1970s and 1980s, social psychology faced a crisis, right?
Oh, yes, it did.
Yeah, I'm trying to be nice
You're
about this.
right.
But considerable debate over the value of research, theory in the field, and I read that attitude research sort of bore the brunt of a
did.
lot of that. Can
It
you
did.
explain for the benefit of, again, somebody who's not in your field, what was going on here, and then I'm going to follow up. What was the nature of the crisis and the criticism?
Well,
Because it seemed to me like it was kind of tearing the field apart.
it's kind of hard to capture it, but I think it was the transition into what we call post-positivism, where it wasn't just in social psychology, although we took it harder than others. People were discovering that these numbers we produced in this science was not that pure, and there was a lot of bias, and oh my God, isn't that terrible? Kenneth Gergen, who was a sort of postmodernist actually as he developed, had the idea of social psychology as history. It all just reflects the culture. We thought we were doing science. And so and then there was the instability of data, which we do still deal with. Do studies replicate, and does it sort of add up? That was very much at issue. And so people were taking it harder in social psychology, I think, than in other areas of psychology. But I think it was a maturation of the field as we began to deal in a more knowledgeable and sophisticated way with what science sort of really is, which it's not this sort of pure thing, and the numbers are representing the mind or whatever in a nice orderly way, but it's really messy. We get methods, they're kind of terribly imperfect. There's bias in the lab. There's all kinds of things. Robert Rosenthal at that time even discovered that the rat studies, that the experimenters were influencing the rats to give the right answers, by petting them, the nice ones, and whatever. And so it's kind of a shock we were so naive before that, so it was a shock. And we recovered, and became more sensible. And I don't think there's enough discourse about sort of the epistemology or whatever, but I think we sort of collectively recovered and developed a more mature way of thinking about our science and the way we need to build in, as we become aware of biases, then we have to talk about, well, what do we do about that one,
Mm-hmm.
So then we have to adjust. And we need multiple methods that have, multiple impure methods looking at the same problem. So it was just a period in which we had to suddenly grow up.
Do you think that was a beneficial process?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It happened in all the sciences.
So I'm trying to think this through from a person on the outside, but a scientist, not a social scientist, would probably argue that that a research project is only successful if the results can be replicated.
Right.
And as fields like psychology became social science, then you also had to argue that the research was only successful if the experiment could be replicated. But that depended upon how you coded things on the numbers.
It depended on many things. And that's true of other science fields as well. But we just didn't know how to think about it. We didn't realize the vulnerability of the findings.
Mm-hmm.
We were naive. But that was true of other sciences.
Mm-hmm.
This is a sort of a much broader than psychology type of movement.
Right.
But psychologists don't usually have much perspective on it, actually. And so, I don't know why we took it harder in social psychology. I think it's, social psychology has these ideas about, a lot of the work is lab work, that we're sort of modeling life out there in the world, but we're producing it in this purified lab, but we can generalize it. Well, that all got called into question. How easy is that to do? Well, other kinds of psychology, it's not necessarily that they're interested in this direct generalization to something complex like social interaction. If you're studying how the eye works or something, or just some aspects of memory or whatever, you're not up against that generalizability problem in the same way. So I think there are reasons why we took it harder in social psychology, but it was a growing up, and it was good we had our crisis. We could have had it in maybe a more sensible way or a more gradual way, or we could have had better leadership other than sort of a postmodernist attack.
So, do you think that part of the reason for the depth and, the frantic nature of the crisis was there wasn't any leadership?
There was leadership, but it was Kenneth Gergen, who was the social psychology at history, who sort of was one of the causes of bringing it on, and he achieved a great deal of visibility, but he took a sort of postmodernist view. There is no ability of science to represent that world out there as his career developed. But then there were these other things that were simultaneous, the discovery of bias in the lab, Robert Rosenthal's work and other people's. And so those things, they sort of fed on one another. And there wasn't, but there was leadership that was positive, actually, that developed. And that actually, one of the prominent people there was Donald Campbell, who was a prominent social psychologist, who did deal with the epistemology and did write in a sensible way about the way science actually works, So there was good, I take that back, there was good leadership that then developed in the 60s and into the 70s and helped us to come along out of the crisis.
What emerged out of that crisis?
a more mature science, a more mature social psychology. We're not astounded that there's bias, but we always try to work in the post-positive fashion to build in protections to understand bias and to move so for instance, in the lab, the most basic thing is if you're manipulating something, so these people get this condition and those people get that one, we can't have experimenters who know what condition they're in, because then they might send subtle messages. Right. We're supposed to get this result over there, and even unknowingly, they can bias, just like with the rats. And so we've developed more sophisticated ways of experimentation, and also I think mostly people realize that we have to work in natural settings as well, and we have to then see how it all fits together. So we became more mature and sophisticated, more effective. We're still working, we still got a lot of problems. We're still working.
So if you're a feminist,
yeah,
and as a feminist social psychologist, scientist, you decide to study gender and sex differences, do you then recognize that there's the potential for a built-in bias?
Right,
try
and
to
then
correct for that?
That of course feminists brought the idea of androcentric bias, into prominence, and that was a very important theme. Yeah,
okay.
And that's the other methodologists had not. They talked about basically biases in the methods, biases in the measuring instruments. They didn't talk about broader biases based on social position or gender. Okay. And the feminists did collectively bring that in.
Okay, we're being paid, so
Yeah.
I want to tell you before that the first thing that I want to ask you next time we sit down is about the psychology of attitudes.
Okay.
Which was a meta-analysis of that fit into that crisis.
Oh yeah, I did an early meta-analysis and I think meta-analysis helped address the crisis because it addresses replicability.
And I think before I do that, I'm going to ask you to explain what meta-analysis
is.
That
would
no, we won't do that right now, but I just want to give you a heads up, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time together talking about your scholarship.
Okay.
And we'll go from sex differences and gender to leadership and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I hope you'll recognize that if I'm not asking you the right question, that you'll help me along here.
I know you're doing good.
Recorder on. So, well, today is November 2nd, 2013. My name is Philip Scarpino. I have the privilege to be doing a second oral history session with Alice Eagly, who was a Lifetime Achievement winner through the International Leadership Association. For users of this interview, there's a more extensive biographical statement on her with the first interview and also a discussion of the process that we used. So I'd like to ask your permission to record this interview, to have the interview transcribed, and then to place the recording and the transcription in the IUPUI Special Collections and Archives with the International Leadership Association and the Tobias Center, where they'll be used by patrons, which may include posting all or parts of these interviews to their websites.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you. So last time, when we wrapped up, we were talking about the crisis in psychology, especially social psychology. And I want to circle back around to that, but as I explained when the recording was off, I'd like to do two things toward the beginning of this interview, or to talk to you about two things that I think have had a significant influence on your career and on the literature of your field. And one is a research method, meta-analysis, and the other is a theory, social role theory. And I thought if we started with meta-analysis, I could then bridge back to where we were last time. Mm-hmm. So, I did a little bit of checking and talking with some of your colleagues and found out that Gene Glass, a statistician, educational psychologist, coined the term meta-analysis and described its use in his presidential address at the American Educational Research Association in 1976. He applied meta-analysis to a large body of literature in outcome studies performed by psychotherapists. In 1980, he published a book, Benefits of Psychotherapy, which he co-authored with Mary Lee Smith and Thomas Miller. So, as I understand it, meta-analysis made use of increasingly powerful computers available to researchers and is a highly refined quantitative technique. So, for the benefit of people who don't know very much about this, could you start by explaining the technique of meta-analysis that Glass developed?
Yes, I can do that. Well, as the word meta-analysis implies, it's an analysis of analyses. So it's a way of taking the findings of multiple studies that have addressed the same hypothesis together, taking them together and using their data, their quantitative data, to examine what might be the general conclusion from a body of studies. They may be consistent or inconsistent in their findings, and that is important to understand. So what a meta-analyst would do is not only to average them and say, well, the average finding is whatever, but would look at the inconsistencies, the variability in the findings across the studies, and then endeavor to explain that in terms of the attributes of the studies. Well, maybe they were done in different settings, they might have used different kinds of measures, they might have used different types of participants, and so the studies would differ on a number of attributes, but they all were testing the same hypothesis in some sense. So then you could use those attributes to try to explain the differences between the studies, so that they wouldn't just be, well, confusing to people. That sometimes, you can get even opposite findings in studies that address the same hypothesis, but it's for some reason usually. And so the meta-analyst attempts to discover those reasons and then, in other words, make sense out of a research literature that perhaps had been confusing to people.
So, given what we talked about last time, right at the end of our session, is meta-analysis a more sophisticated tool for identifying hidden bias in research?
It can be, right, because one of the things that you would code, the studies on would be aspects of their methods that we might know produce bias or presume to produce bias. And so you could look to see whether the presumed bias made a difference in the findings, so that it would address that. And also, in a broader sense, it addresses the instability of findings, because one of the problems in the crisis, and still a problem to some extent, but that findings are not necessarily consistent, the replicability of findings. And so the meta-analyst addresses that, are they replicable, are they consistent, but they do it in a proper way, statistically. It's not appropriate, as in the kind of informal ways that we had earlier, just to do it by statistical significance. Well, these people got it because it was significant, and these people didn't get it because significance is highly responsive to the sample size.
So when you talk about statistical significance, you're talking about something like a coefficient of correlation or something that maybe somebody
right.
heard of?
Well, and then it may be significant or not. That is, it might be very unlikely to be due to random error.
Okay.
That's what it's significant,
Okay.
Like there's only a 5% chance or 1% chance that it could be due to random error is what the significance represents. But significance is very responsive to the sample size.
Okay.
A small finding can be highly significant if you have 10,000 subjects, almost,
Right.
But then if you had a study with 20 subjects, well then you'd have to have a much bigger effect. So in meta-analysis, we look at the size of the effect irrespective of the significance, and that would be an appropriate way to see whether the findings are consistent across the studies. So people had not done it that way before, even though it's kind of obvious. You should do it that way. So a lot of the presumed inconsistencies that have so bothered researchers, in some cases were not inconsistent at all when you looked at it more appropriately, with more appropriate statistics. But of course, then there are inconsistencies, and then true inconsistencies, and then the meta-analyst tries to explain them, and often is quite successful. So it's a way of, when people think that findings, it's so confusing, or nothing's consistent, or whatever, it often, reverses that conclusion and says, there's quite a lot of consistency here, and that people did the studies in different ways, and that's at least in part why they got somewhat different findings. So it has been very important in psychology and to some extent in other sciences to use this technique.
And does the success of the technique depend upon the skill with which the person doing it codes?
Well, yes, right. You have to be able to notice the differences in the studies and code them, yeah. So if you don't sort of know anything about methodology or about the particular literature, you might not be very clever at that. Yeah.
So could you, because Glass and his co-authors were looking at outcome studies performed by psychotherapists.
Right.
Could you just sort of briefly explain what they found that
yes,
brought this technique and their work to people's attention?
Yeah, that a question for a psychologist was, and a really important one, is does psychotherapy help people?
Right.
Do they get better? And there had been some prominent statements that no, they don't. But of course, most people thought, well, it does, but there had been challenges to that. And so he and Smith, his colleague, attempted to find, all the available studies, and they meta-analyzed, and they found that, in general, psychotherapy did help people. Mm-hmm. And then they looked to some extent at the, the attributes of the studies, more or less, or different types of psychotherapy. Now there are probably maybe even 100 or so such meta-analyses about psychotherapy, so we know a lot more about the details. But just the overwhelming conclusion that in general, yes, it is, the outcomes are positive, was very important.
So how did you find out about this technique?
Well, it was, it was sort of beginning, in the air, but when it was sort of a bit by accident, because I had published an article, a review in the narrative form, the form in which we didn't use meta-analysis, where we were interpreting studies largely by their significance, It was on gender and social influence. And then a person by the name of Harris Cooper published a meta-analysis in the same area. He was one of the early, very, very early adopters of meta-analysis. And so I had done this other review, and I had some thoughts about his interpretation or whatever not being quite right, and I was in a sense challenged by the publication of his paper. And so I thought, well, yeah, but I can't respond adequately unless I do this new technique. I did see its superiority. I did see the rationale for its superiority. And so then I did my first meta-analysis. That was very early. And so I had to learn the technique. I don't think the textbook was quite, Glass and Smith. A textbook wasn't out yet. But I kind of laboriously sort of figured out how to do it, and so I was able to publish that paper, and I felt that was good. And then as an early adopter, I knew how to go forward and do more meta-analyses. I thought it would be important in this gender area because just around the basic question about whether men and women differ in behavior was actually a big question. It is a big question, still a big question. Do they differ, and is it nature or nurture? So then I took on some other domains which had basically not been meta-analyzed. And so it was an opportunity to address the questions that people had been addressing, but that there hadn't been any agreement about exactly what the answer is, So you could then get this broader perspective by looking at all the literature.
So to make sure that I have it, the title of the first paper that you published using meta-analysis was what?
I don't remember exactly. It might have been gender and influenceability, or gender. Yeah, it was on the basic question of whether men or women are more easily influenced. Stereotypically, at least at that time, it was, that women might be more compliant or more influenceable. And so there were different domains in social psychology. There were conformity studies, and then there were just sort of persuasion studies.
But I'm going to actually ask you about that article in a minute. So
okay.
All right, now I want to go back and let's see if I can connect the dots. So last time, when we wrapped up, we were talking about the crisis in the field, and we discussed that, and you explained what was going on. But you also responded to that crisis in the form of a true scholar. You wrote a book about it, and the book was The Psychology of Attitudes with Shelley Chaikin.
Oh yes, Chaikin.
Chaiken for
right.
the transcriber, and you employed meta-analysis in that study.
Not particularly in that book.
Okay.
When there were meta-analyses, we drew on them, but. Yes, we did draw on them, but the other book that I wrote, early book, was on sex differences in social behavior.
Yeah.
That's where I more explicitly drew on the meta-analyses that I had done, which were on gender.
Let's do this, and we'll come back and do the other.
Okay.
So you wrote The Psychology of Attitudes,
right.
Which drew on other people's meta-analyses, but. Why did you decide to write that book?
Well, it was in a way a response to the crisis, because since this attitudes area in social psychology had been so prominent prior to the crisis, then the kinds of critiques that people developed who furthered the crisis often pointed to the attitudes literature as faulty or misguided in various ways. So I believed that this work on attitudes was quite glorious, actually, that it had many strands. There were a number of different kinds of approaches. There were different questions within the study of attitudes. Do attitudes influence behavior? How do we form attitudes? How do you change them? And so there had been quite a wonderful historical, theoretical tradition over quite a long time. And so it was sort of the prototype area of social psychology, and that people could think it was, maybe not worth a whole lot, seemed misguided. And so with Shelley Chaikin, who was a wonderful collaborator, we decided to write this book, and it ended up being sort of a bigger book than we had anticipated, I guess, but there was a lot there which we were trying to integrate and to make accessible, because it was, widely dispersed, and some of it was dense, really dense for graduate students to read. To make it accessible and sort of give this larger framework. And the book, I think, has been, quite successful, beyond, in a sense, my initial expectations. And it took a number of years to write, and I was fortunate to be able to do it with Shelley Chaikin, because she's a brilliant woman, and, and she and I...
Was she one of your students?
She was,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. She... has a great deal of rigor in her thinking, and is a very good writer. So between the two of us, we produced that book. And so it was a response to the crisis, to those who didn't sort of understand what this body of work really was and why it was important. I think we did successfully express that or make that known.
So for the non-specialist in your field, what did you find? How did your work in that book address the crisis?
Well, by bringing together this body, several sub-bodies actually of research and theory about attitudes into this larger structure. So when you read it in the literature in its original form, there's articles and articles and articles here and there, and then these people say this and these people say that, and so it's hard to, in a sense, make sense out of it. So by bringing it together in a compelling way, I think we were able to show the quality of the work and its cumulative quality. And that there are many important discoveries, but it's such a big area that you can't say, well, we found this, because it is, the study of attitudes has many traditions within it and many large sub-questions, and so to put all that together in a book was in a way that would be integrative, was a weighty task. And then to make it all accessible. We saw our prototype audience as being like a graduate student, like a first-year graduate student. They're supposed to learn about this attitudes area. To make it accessible in that way, it wasn't to be a book to be read by anybody in the public. So I think we were successful in that. It was, a sort of a kind of a big intellectual task to do that, and it took a good deal of persistence on our part to carry it through.
When I looked it up last week or 2 weeks ago, Psychology of Attitudes had 7,793 citations, which are most cited work.
Right.
How do you account for that staying power?
Well, because of the breadth of the book, and often, even now, the book came out in '93, so it's not very new, but when people talk about, they say, the definition of attitudes or something like that, they often cite it, so it's gotten that status as, in terms of a basic work,
I don't mean this question to sound flip, but it may sound this way. You describe the body of work on attitudes as glorious.
Mm-hmm.
How do you control for that bias?
Mm-hmm. Well, you have to love it to spend 6 years writing a book about
it. That's true. I tell my thesis students, you at least got to want to date it for a while, or it isn't going to work.
Right. So many of the most prominent social psychologists of the generation before that had worked on this topic. There were quite a few very brilliant scholars who had devoted their work to that area. So that was the glory of it, that there was such, in some areas there was really admirable, impressive work, but somebody needed to rescue it, in a sense, for the next generation, or for the current generation. I think we did, in a sense,
I wanted to shift to the subject of gender and sex differences, and talking to a woman who's written hundreds of articles, I'm going to ask you a question you might not be able to answer, but the first article that I could find that you published on gender was titled Sex Differences in the Relationship Between Self-Esteem and Susceptibility to Social Influence, Journal of Personality, 1969. Is that the first one?
I think it is, right. And that was a minor article, I'll have to say, that I was interested in, persuasion and social influence. That was this, whether people are easily influenced, and self-esteem is a dispositional variable. And so, I don't even remember quite what the finding was, but so I was interested in that, and in whether, and then later whether the more general question whether under what circumstances men or women might be more easily influenced. So the question was, I took it beyond that early, rather minor paper. I doubt if that has many citations.
I wish I could tell you that I looked this one up, but I didn't. But what I can say, one of the things that struck me, though, is that the first piece that I could find that you've done on gender worked with the topic of self-esteem. Is there a reason for that? Was that what drew you in, young women and self-esteem?
Well, not so much, really. Self-esteem is, a classic kind of personality variable in psychology. And there had been some interest on the relationship between self-esteem and being persuaded. And so, I'm just moving into that tradition.
So later on, when you did begin to explore gender and leadership, did self-esteem play a role?
No, I haven't used self-esteem in that context.
Okay. All right. So most assessments that I could find of your work point to an article titled Sex Differences and Influenceability. Psychological Bulletin 1978 is the real beginning of your career as a feminist social.
Right.
Psychology researchers, is that
yes,
right?
Yes,
Do you agree with that? Okay.
That's that narrative review.
It's the one you talked about a few minutes ago.
Yeah,
right, okay.
That's that narrative review,
okay.
Which was quite successful as a paper, but it was this end of the pre-meta-analytic phase.
So part of what happened there is that you realized that you were bumping up against a limit for analyzing
right,
large
that was a
bodies of
classic
literature.
narrative review, even though I got quite a lot of it won 2 prizes, but then in retrospect, it turned out to be the last gasp of the classic way of doing reviews.
So when I talked to Linda Cartley, she told me that in the latter part of the 1970s, when you were turning your attention to gender and sex differences, that those topics were on the periphery of the field of psychology and social psychology.
Right.
That's okay, a fair assessment. So by the late 1970s, you were already a well-established scholar.
Right.
Did you ever think that moving your research agenda toward gender and sex differences might pose a risk for you?
No, I already had tenure.
Well, that's true, you did.
So I wasn't personally feeling a sense of risk. I, of course, knew it wasn't...
I was going to ask it a different way, and I held back. Did you ever feel that dealing with a subject matter that was on the periphery of your field could have moved you to the periphery of the field? That was the risk.
Well, I knew that it wasn't something that everybody was working on or that was seen as being central. However, there was a huge amount of public interest because of the women's movement. Right. And so I thought, well, there's a lot of interest. When I did those early projects, there was a huge amount of interest. It wasn't that I was getting such status within the field, though. But I felt that I was interested, people are interested. How could gender not be important? Isn't it more our problem as social psychologists that we haven't addressed it, rather than it being inherently unimportant? How could it be unimportant? And so I sort of went ahead, but I continued to work on attitudes. I was doing both for a number of years.
And those 2 areas of research connect? Attitudes and gender?
Well, they did initially because I was interested in persuasion in relation to gender. Yes, they did initially connect. That's how I sort of made that transition, and I continued to study attitudes and have even in recent years done some work, and so that was in a way a protection, because I had my very mainstream work too, and then the gender work was initially kind of an add-on, which then branched out and became more important, became the major theme after a number of years.
As you moved in that area, did you find that there was any shift in the graduate students and their interests, the folks who wanted to work with you? Were you attracting more and more people who were interested in gender because you were doing it?
Well, yes. Yeah, I think so. Over the years, right, yeah.
So
sex differences and influenceability frequently appears as a pivotal piece in your life's work, important contribution to scholarship. I did look this one up. It ranks about 30th in your citation index. So, given the significance, can you briefly explain what you found for people who are not in your field? Is it possible to do that?
Sure. It was interesting. We found that there are three types of studies. There are persuasion studies where the participant maybe gets some written or audio or videotaped material to listen to, which is counter-attitudinal. In some context they get this, and then there may be before and after measures, or just after measures with an experiment where people are in different conditions. They get the information in different ways or whatever. And so we found in that domain there's little evidence that men and women react differently. But where you find more difference is in conformity studies. The classic conformity study is a group, an actual group, where people are sitting around, but only one is a real participant, the others are Confederates. And so in the classic one, they're judging the lengths of, it's really bold, they're judging the lengths of lines, and it's pretty clear which line is longer or shorter. But then on some of the trials, the other people of the group give the wrong answer. And so it's kind of confusing to the real participant. So conformity is defined as going along with the group. You're going to say it's line B, but you could see it's actually line A. So it's not a comfortable situation. But then there are many variants. They're not just, they're not always judging lines or something. So in the actual groups, we do find that women agree more with the others than men do. That's some greater conformity.
And why do you think that is?
Well, that's was the interesting question. So the classic view is just, women are sort of more submissive in a sense. And then the alternative view would be that women are more attentive to the social context and sort of interested more in cooperating with the other people in some way. And this is a pretty trivial situation. It's not life or death.
Right.
You say line A or B, come on now. So there's that it's a sort of more social inclination. But later I did some research that followed from this, some new research. And what we found is that in a situation where there's an audience of other people, as opposed to you give your answer, nobody knows about it, it's the men who change, not the women. And so the real interpretation might be that the men like to stand out more, from the others, rather than that the women are submissive or more cooperative or more anything, because they didn't change at all. They said the same thing alone or with the other people. So that was a great insight. And that came after this meta-analysis. But the meta-analysis helped us understand the phenomenon that it was embedded in groups and social interaction, not just in general being persuaded. So that was an advance.
Did that help you see nature or nurture?
Well, nature and nurture were not really clarified there. So if men want to stand out, that is in part a route to leadership. You have to distinguish yourself in some ways from the other people in the group. And so if that is part of the motivation, would that be nature or nurture? It does not reveal that.
Okay. All right.
But it turned out to be an interesting kind of series of the primary research, the new research, and the meta-analysis. I did learn something, and yeah.
So I'm going to try another. I'm going to ask you about 1981. 1981 was actually a remarkably good year for you. You published 4 referee journal articles, one of which was Sex of Researchers and Sex-Type Communications as Determinants of Sex Differences and Influenceability. Yeah. And that was a meta-analysis.
That's the meta-analysis that followed from the initial narrative review.
You co-authored with Linda Carley. She was one of your doctoral students.
Yes.
UMass Amherst at that time,
Yes.
although you were at Purdue in 1981.
Yes,
Yeah.
then I moved while she was still a graduate student, so she did her dissertation with another professor because I had left.
So in this article, the sex of researchers, sex type communications as determinants of sex differences and influenceability, a meta-analysis. You were combining a new quantitative analytical method with your relatively new research agenda. So why did you elect to apply a meta-analysis to your research on gender and sex roles?
Well, that was the follow-up to that narrative review that I published in 1978, because Harris Cooper had done this other paper that was meta-analytic. So then I felt I needed to take another look with the new technique. And we did find some things there. One thing that was quite surprising, which was that the sex of the researcher or the author of the paper made a difference. And this was somewhat awkward, actually. So in the male-authored papers, it was more likely that women were found more influenceable than men. The female-authored papers, that was less so. So that raised the question about, oh, really? Why is that? And we found another data set that another researcher, Judith Hall, had published on, I think it was on like a form of social sensitivity where women are higher than men. And we also looked at sex of author within her data set, and we found an analogous finding. So it raised the question of whether there's some bias on the part of researchers in what findings they report or how they do the research or whatever. So it raised that question, which has sort of been pursued since then by many people, because lots of people who then do these meta-analyses on these kinds of questions do look at the sex of the author as a potential determinant of the findings.
So if you determined that the sex of the author was influencing the outcome, has that helped psychologists figure out ways to control those biases, or just to know that they're there?
On that one, not so clearly, because it may be true. I think the most likely explanation is that researchers are selective in what they put in the article. So many studies where maybe you're studying aggression or some aspect of social behavior, you're not interested in gender, perhaps. Well, you might be in aggression, but in some domains you're not particularly. And so it's a kind of a subsidiary finding. You could choose to compare the males and females or not, and if you compare them, you could report the outcome or not. And so you might report the outcome that pleased you, or if it pleased you, you would report it. You don't make it up, okay, because there's a finding, but you could choose to put it in your article or not, because it's not essential to what you were trying to do.
You could also choose to decide what it means.
And you could just But let's say a male researcher might be quite pleased to find the old stereotypes are true, you know, that these women are submissive or whatever, and put it in, while a woman might not, you know. Or the woman might be, if she gets the null finding that made no difference, might be more motivated to put it in. And similarly in social sensitivity, that's a good thing. And so women might be delighted to find that the women are more socially sensitive than men, where the man might, you know, ignore the finding as not part of his agenda. So I think it's something in the selectivity of reporting, probably more than a bias in the way the study's done. And so that's a more difficult aspect of the science to regulate.
So, for the benefit of people who will use this interview, I'm wondering, part of the title of this article is Sex Type Communications.
Right,
What does that mean?
Well, you know, it could be a persuasive communication on football, as opposed to something having to do with cooking, or something more extreme. One they often use on the feminine side is planning a wedding, as opposed to something about football or some sports that men are very interested in. And so then it's the obvious that if it's in your own domain, you would know more about it, presumably you're more resistant. Well, if it's the other sex's domain and you don't know much about it, the average person doesn't know that much about the other domain, they're more influenceable.
Could you do the same thing with influenceability or influenceability? What does that mean?
Well, that just means how much people are influenced.
Okay.
Yeah, the quality of being easily or influenced or more resistant to influence.
Okay, so your co-author, Elizabeth Carly, described your findings as spectacular. She said the piece is held up well. It's 26th on your lifetime citation index. When you look back at this article and assess the impact, I'm going to ask you to assess the impact in two ways. And the first is on your own thinking and your own scholarly career. Mm-hmm. What kind of an impact did that article have on the way you thought?
Well, it was the first meta-analysis I did, and so that we got interesting findings was a motivation, provided a motivation or increased my motivation to do more meta-analyses. Had it been sort of dull, I think it...
So it worked for you, in other words.
Yeah, it worked, and the findings were mildly interesting. I learned something about gender, but not... I guess there might have been some early hints of social role theory in the way I interpreted the findings or whatever, but,
So, how about the impact of this piece on the literature of your field?
Oh, I don't... Well...
I mean, it's still...
Yeah,
you
it
can
has
still read it.
a fair number of citations. I think it gets cited because it was the original piece that brought up the sex of author bias. Mm-hmm. As far as the influence findings, it would sometimes be cited for those within the gender literature. But it gets cited a lot because of or modest, not huge, but it gets cited fairly well. When people then say they need to look at sex of author, and then if they're with it, they may cite, how you cite the early piece that found it,
So in the next decade, after you published this article in 1981, you published a number of papers employing meta-analysis, many of which explored gender, sex roles. You co-authored with several of your graduate students. Is that part of your mentoring strategy to sort of launch your students on their careers by co-authoring?
Oh, yes, we do that. I mean, that's not... We are expected to do that as professors of psychology. We work with our students, and they are definitely co-authors, and they can't get jobs unless they have those articles out there. So it's very important to produce work and have them as co-authors.
So when I talked to Linda Carly and read and talked to other people, I came to the conclusion that when you began applying meta-analysis to gender and sex differences, that your doing that highlighted a split or a debate in which some feminist scholars argued that using a quantitative tool like meta-analysis was the equivalent of selling out. Maybe that's my term, I'm paraphrasing, but the idea being that historically men use these kinds of methods, feminist scholars employed more qualitative work, and here you were doing what the men were doing.
There is
was
that...
Was there such a rift, and were you...
Well, I think not within the mainstream of psychology, there never was that rift. But there are feminist scholars who, within or not within psychology or not within the mainstream, in the mainstream we're all about hypothesis testing and quantification. So it was absolutely not controversial there. And there are feminist scholars, in the mainstream. Lots of them, probably most of them. But most of them, I would say. But then there is that other stream that would be very interested in qualitative that's non-quantified, and then often accompanying that there's a postmodernist epistemology that the whole hypothesis testing thing, and trying to refine understanding of the reality is hopeless. And so that, because of that type of thinking, it's excluded from the mainstream. It is excluded from any high citation journal, quite frankly. I've looked at this very carefully recently in a paper that I'm working on now, or that I have finished, on the feminist critique of methods and epistemology. So that was a minority voice, but it was, a lot of the feminists who actually wrote on epistemology or methods were not in the mainstream, because it's a critical theory type voice, and so those of us who are happily going along, in the scientific mainstream, we're not writing particularly about methods, because we weren't critics. So you might get the impression that lots and lots of feminists were of that alternative view, but most feminist psychologists who do research are the so-called feminist empiricists. We're right in the mainstream. We do the usual thing. We get published in really good journals.
No, I know you do.
But there was that critical voice out there. Yes.
Although when you started this research, there were not very many scholars doing it.
Well, but it fit into the mainstream science tradition, because we were taking the scientific method into reviewing. And so those who were in the scientific mainstream were thinking, feminist or not, of course, why did it take us so long to figure that out?
Right.
So it was absolutely non-controversial among kind of the mainstream of social psychology, or for that matter psychology, but among feminists there was this alternative epistemology and the putting forward of pure qualitative methods uncontaminated by quantification. And they're still there, but they're still not, they don't get into the high citation journals. They don't get into the science tradition, but there are other journals and there are other communities, of course, where they...
Who were some of the folks that were writing along the lines that were...
there's a woman by the name of Jean Marisek, who is one in that group, and there's Mary Crawford, and then there's a particularly strong contingent in Britain. A woman by the name of Wilkinson, and some of the people who've worked with her. Also, that stream of feminism, it exists in the United States, but it's also it's strong in Britain and then a few other places. So if you track it, as I did in a recent article, you'll find quite a lot of representation of outside of the U.S.
So you did think of yourself as a feminist social psychologist.
Right.
How did you respond to criticism from feminists?
Well, it wasn't as if there was a lot of direct criticism. It's just that they went along doing their thing, publishing in very different places. And then the rest of us went along doing our thing in the scientific mainstream. And it wasn't as if we had much direct contact, or it wasn't like they were writing articles attacking me or the other feminist empiricists, although there was always this questioning of, the scientific mainstream, for sure, and the presentation of alternative methods. So I didn't feel directly under attack. I did think, that it is ridiculous to say that we can't use methods because men use them. It's why should we give men all that power? Quantitative methods are powerful and they're persuasive with the public and lots of audiences. We should not use them. Come on now. That would so undercut our power to get the feminist message across. I didn't write an article. Well, I guess I did say that a bit, but not in that quite in that bold way. But it would really compromise, and we would have no credibility in the scientific mainstream, which of course we need. Yeah.
So as the body of literature within the scientific mainstream grew on gender and sex differences, did those initial differences diminish?
Well, that's an interesting
Now,
question.
you mentioned that you just finished an article
Right,
on a piece
no,
which I
yes.
didn't know you were working on.
Right, it's still there, so to speak, but at least among some of the, let me just call them postmodernists, there's a bit of softening, that a realization that a body of work based entirely on non-quantitative methods would perhaps not be that ideal. So there's some softening of that view. There's little softening in the scientific mainstream about totally unquantified qualitative methods. They are virtually absent in the high citation journals. It's fine to use narrative materials and narrative methods, get people to talk, but then it's coded by two people independently, and you have to have reliability, so, but, or it's sent through computer programs, that count words in various ways. And that kind of qualitative work is very welcome, lots of us use it, but what the postmodernists have usually argued for is the freedom from quantification, male methods, and so it's just sort of you analyze, no second coder usually, but you just sort of analyze themes, and given all we know about the bias of researchers, it's so wildly open to bias if there's no second person looking at it. It's just like, well, I say the theme is this. I say, you do? Yeah, how do I know if that's true? You may have picked something very uncommon, just because that's your bias. So, they're hard-pressed, I think, to maintain the position that has been taken, and you could begin to see a bit of softening. Yeah, but it's still there, this disagreement about, essentially about epistemology and science.
I'm going to ask you what may seem like an unrelated question, but if I did my math right, your two daughters were born while you were at the University of Massachusetts?
It's true.
1967 to 80. We talked just yesterday or 2 days ago, you were a two-career family. Your husband's an economist. And one of your graduate students remembered you bringing your children to work.
Right. When they were young in the first year.
Did you do that because you had to, or because you were trying to?
Because I was breastfeeding.
Make it stay. Well, that would do it, but I mean.
Yeah, because I was breastfeeding, and so you have to do it comfortably and well. You have to be sort of in a symbiotic relationship with the child, and so yeah. So I did with my second child, who was born in 1977. The University of Massachusetts had an infant child care center, so that was magnificent. And I was able to bring Ursula in the morning to this small center and leave her with caretakers, and then come back at noon, and pick her up. And then I took her to my office in the afternoon, and then, and then went home later.
Did you have anything to do with the creation of that center?
No. It was a professor in I think the School of Education who did it, yeah.
I mean, so...
It was a research site also.
I mean, you did this because you had to, but did you ever feel as though you were sort of modeling a way of life for other women in the academy?
Yes, I think in 1969, when our daughter Ingrid was born, that was sort of the very beginning of the feminist movement, and so it was. University of Massachusetts was always a rather liberal place, but the reaction then was sort of, oh, well, all right. It was like silence. But it wasn't really disapproval. It was sort of a neutral, or let us reserve judgment kind of reaction. But then in 1977, we had a lot of women's movement, and people said, oh, how wonderful! How wonderful, you're like a heroine to do this. We're so glad to see little Ursula here. And so then
well, your students thought you were a heroine, so that was
well, people were very encouraging, and it was different. It was because the culture had shifted that much.
So I'll be naive. I mean, you brought your children to work, but what did other women do?
Well,
who were working? I mean, working.
Well, professors have a low birth rate. I think for staff women it would have been difficult. I mean, maybe it's a little unfair. The professors have this freedom. You teach your class, but you're not always on call,
right?
And you could arrange your schedule. But other women, I remember at Massachusetts, my colleague Ronnie Janoff Bowman, who was younger than me, she was so encouraged by the fact I brought, her office was next to mine, and then I think I left then soon after that, but she was encouraged to have a child earlier than she was assistant professor, to have one when she was assistant professor. And then I think she did more or less the same. And so she always tells me that, how encouraging that was. So certainly you see it, but there's kind of a low birth rate.
But you did it because you had to, not to make so much to make a statement about.
Right, because if you're breastfeeding, as I said, you can't just, it really doesn't work. You just show up every 3 or 4 hours, because the child's needs change so much as she gets, even a little bit older. And so you really need to make it work easily and comfortably, you have to be in a very close relationship.
I mean, did you find that you described University of Massachusetts at Amherst as a liberal place?
Yes.
Did you find it at the time that you were breastfeeding your first child that the university had any official cognizance of the needs of women who were nursing?
Well, no, except this.
I mean, we do now. I mean,
yeah. This child care center was magnificent. That appeared in 1977. Yeah. Because to have the child nearby was, that makes it all so much easier. And of course the caretakers were built in, and they were highly qualified. Yeah.
I mean, when my kids were little, old enough to sit up, I used to take them to class with me and put them in the back of the room with a coloring book, and
great.
Nobody ever said anything, but that
right.
was a few years later.
Yeah, universities tend to be rather tolerant environments and fairly liberal, and
I mean,
I think that's a good thing.
When my oldest got to the point where he thought that he should put his hand up and answer the questions, they weren't coming to class with me anymore, but that was not my problem.
Well, good for you. Yeah, I mean, this is good, and it's great to see the men doing it. Yeah, I had a male colleague recently who occasionally showed up with the baby. Not often, though.
How did you see your own role within the developing feminist movement outside of the academy?
Oh, well, in doing research, there was, the hope that it would speak to social issues, I guess, about the status of women. But, that's a complex sort of relationship between research and then the public discourse. So I wasn't out there writing magazine articles or something like that. In a way, I would have sort of liked to, but that wasn't. I had to tend to my business of being a researcher. So it's sort of a faith that if we understand better the phenomena of gender from a science perspective, that would be a good thing in the long run in terms of understanding how the conditions under which greater equality might be produced.
Okay. I was going to ask you this question at the end, but you gave me an opening right now. Based upon all the work that you've done as a scholar for decades, if you had a way to influence the people who raise children, educate children, what would you want them to know that might have a positive impact?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, but a difficult one. They should know that parents need to know that they're part of the gender phenomenon. And I'm not one who believes it's all nurture either, because there are temperamental differences between boys and girls that appear very early and are unlikely to be due to nurture. But nurture promotes them in various ways. And so a lot of parents think they're not part of the process. But then, when researchers look at the toys that boys and girls have, and the way the parents interact with the boys and girls, there are differences, certainly in the realm of toys and activities and that sort of thing. And a lot of parents think they're not part, that they're treating them the same, but usually they're not. And so there's this sort of lack of awareness, and just the very model of if the mom is more in charge of the child,
right,
or works part-time or is a stay-at-home mother, then there's this powerful traditional learning going on.
Right.
And so a lot of parents think, but it wasn't us, we didn't do it. And so it must be all nature. And we're just responding to the child. So to get parents to see themselves as more part of the process. And if they're truly committed to gender equality, then they have to live it. Parents, it's not just what they say; it's powerfully what they do. So they need to think it through more than I think the typical parent does, who doesn't. They often just don't think that they're part of the process when they're actually a very powerful part of the process.
I want to ask you about social role theory, which you explain on your social psychology site as a theory of sex differences and similarities and the origins of sex differences in social behavior. And the first question I'm going to ask you is either really good or really naive. Did you develop social role theory, or did you borrow it? I mean, did it already exist and you adapted it, or are you...
No, it was novel in this context. Not that there are no similar ideas running around, but really, I think I can claim it. Yeah.
Okay. Can you explain, for the benefit of people who use this interview, what social role theory is?
Well, social roles take a prominent place in the theory, in that in all societies there's some division of labor between men and women. They're not evenly distributed into roles, occupationally or in the home, and that is seen as being a key determinant, what men and women do, of the psychology of men and women. But on the origin side, you could say, well, but the division of labor is just all nature. And the view that I've taken is that it's in part nature, in that men and women differ. Most obviously biologically, women give birth and men are larger and stronger. And so those characteristics of men and women, those obvious biological characteristics, interact with the external environment.
Mhm.
So in different periods of human history, there's been a very different, economic and social structure and political structure and ecology out there. And that interacts with the characteristics of men and women to produce the division of labor. The division of labor differs a lot across societies. And so we could understand the division of labor, and it has some arbitrariness about it, but it's sensible in terms of the characteristics of men and women, and the external environment. Obviously, babies have to be produced, or we
Right.
disappear,
Right.
right? And certain tasks have to be.
The Shakers got themselves in a lot of trouble.
Yes,
Weren't gonna be
right.
produced.
Yes, some of those societies that were not, had forbidden sex, they didn't do too well. So, but then certain jobs have to be done, and in some circumstances, there were a lot of jobs that, men were better at because they're bigger and stronger. So if they're going to, go out whaling on the ocean or cut down trees or, in primitive circumstances, deal with iron ore, men had to do those things because they were better suited. And furthermore, women were doing this childbearing and lactation business. And they could do other things that were compatible with that, however, that were economically productive, the gathering and and the foraging societies and all. So, so the division of labor will be variable, and we've seen it in my lifetime change so much. As women went to the workplace, with a great decline in the birth rate was a big thing, and then the change in the economy. Those strength-intensive jobs have eroded like crazy, right? And so the jobs where you sit in an office, you're in front of the computer, whatever, you're interacting with people. Women are by no means less able to do them. There's no physical strength component.
Flying a jet plane or something like
that.
Yeah.
So that it changed the division of labor so much. But then, so we can understand that it's not so radically different as it was. And then the psychology would be wrapped around the division of labor, because when there is a division of labor, it's usually sensible in terms of the situation of that group of humans. So we have to get people to do it, and it has to work. And so then, through socialization, in part, parents prepare children for the world they're going to live in sensibly, right? Mm-hmm. And then the way we think about men and women reflects that division of labor, because as we psychologists know, we understand people in terms of what they do. That is, we call it correspondent inference. So if we see people or a person acting in a kind of a mean way or a hostile way, we say, oh, that's an aggressive person, that's a mean person. We go to the trait to see it as a cause. And similarly, when we see groups of people doing certain kinds of things, we think that group of people must have that inner trait. So if we see women, they seem to take care of babies a lot more than this group over here, they call them men, over there, and women over here, they must be more caring and nurturant, because that's what they're doing, and so they must have this inner trait. And if men are more in leadership roles and roles that might take assertiveness, people think, oh yeah, they're this assertive, agentic, we call it sex. And so then we develop what we call gender roles or gender stereotypes around what we see men and women doing. And then those take on a life of their own in terms of producing different responses to men and women, so we expect them to do these kinds of things, and we think they should, right?
So the sequence, to make sure that I understand it, in any given cultural situation begins with division of labor.
Yes, which in turn reflects the world that they're in.
So once you have a particular division of labor, men do some things, women do other things, that gives rise to the expectations we have of each gender,
Right.
which in turn gives rise to stereotypes.
Right.
Is that the sequence?
Yeah, and then the stereotypes, regulate our behavior, because they're not just, we think that women are nurturant, we think they should be.
Okay. And if you're not, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, there's a kind of prescriptive quality to them too, and so when people move obviously outside of their gender expectations, they get some what we call backlash. So like when women act really tough and assertive, they tend to be disliked, like, we don't like those women. Or if men are very weak and kind of, overly soft, then people think, well, he's kind of, he's okay, but maybe we could, we don't really think that's good. So that creates, that regulates behavior. And then people also take gender inside themselves. They have what we call gender identity, that the culture gets inside the person in many ways. And so then we regulate our own behavior. So each man or woman has an idea of what it would be to be, an appropriate man or woman. And we tend to then deliver our own rewards of...
So we internalize and self-regulate.
Yeah, and self-regulate, and we feel good about ourselves if we meet our own standards, and we feel bad or guilty when we don't. So that's the self-regulation part. And so sort of it's all bound up in this division of labor. And, so that makes people fit into the division of labor, because we got to get things done in a society, right?
So you really developed social role theory.
Yes.
And applied it to the study of gender and sex roles.
Yes.
For the benefit of somebody who's not in your field, how did using that theoretical frame of reference improve what you knew, or focus, or enhance?
Well, it provides a frame for the work, and Wendy Wood has become a very important collaborator in developing the theory, because there was the original theory, and then it has developed over time, and so she's a great collaborator there. And encompassing a more the self-regulatory aspect she's worked on in her own research, and then helping people understand that the sort of biological hormonal mediation supports behavior in an appropriate way. So we're working on that. But well, people have to have a broader framework to understand gender, and it's helpful to have one that has some complexity, but that people can kind of grasp hold of, because they tend to, otherwise there's kind of simple ideas that they might grasp hold of. Oh, it's all nurture, it's socialization, obviously, but that's not very detailed or helpful. And then the other one, well, it's all nature. It's all built in through evolution. That women, of course, they make those choices. They love to nurture, and men love to do these other things, and it's all nature. Well, those are too simple, those ideas. They're not very accurate, I would say. And so then to give people a way to understand, other scientists, even the public, one would hope, needs a way to understand the phenomenon of gender, because they're extremely interesting to people, and they always try to interpret them.
So is social role theory, from the perspective of a feminist psychologist, a mechanism for explaining what exists, or a mechanism for figuring out how to promote equality between men?
Well, it would be both. It should be both. Yeah. So it is to understand what exists, but then if you're to to change what exists, you realize what the task might be when you see these pieces, so that the end result of certain kinds of sex differences or certain kinds of backlash or whatever, they make sense in terms of we can understand why they're there. And so then there are various places where one might intervene within such a way of thinking about, points of potential intervention.
So if we wanted to argue that our economy and society would be better off if we had more female leaders,
Mm-hmm.
and then given what that is you, know about social role theory, how do you bridge from what we know now, or from what exists now, to a situation where more women are likely to become leaders?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the pieces, of course, has to do with women's lesser career intensity when they have children, because there's an inequality usually in the child care. And so obviously that would have to change so women could have more consistent careers and more intensive careers, because people rise in various fields when they have intensive careers,
Right.
not when they're part-time workers. So, there are many ways to do that. So the division of labor in the home, but, on-site child care in workplaces. So, to help women to further their progress toward career success. So there are, multiple ways to intervene there in the way organizations work. Also, there are lots of kinds of interventions in organizations, but like allowing people to to dial back for a few years and then to dial back up without, throwing them away or
Right.
saying that kind of thing. So there's so many things that could be done there. And then, in terms of the lack of approval from, moving beyond your gender role, that's the larger problem, that the division of labor produces those ideas. And so there's no magic there. But, of course, as people get more experience with people, doing the anti-normative thing, they might become more tolerant. If we could get the word out there, that actually that this is producing discrimination. Discrimination
Right.
is illegal. To help people understand it, and how we know as social psychologists that so much of that kind of behavior is sort of implicit. You have no idea you're being biased. You don't. Most people don't want to be biased, and so to help them understand the implicit nature of their biased behaviors, and so that they can perhaps develop a consciousness where they could realize what they're doing, and then organizations could put in checks. Maybe the people don't understand, but we can see the data. We can see what they did. So there are a lot of ways to intervene there. And then on the self side, that would involve women and men changing their own ideas of what they should do as men and women. And we see a lot of that. This book by Sheryl Sandberg is so popular now, The Lean In. Well, that's telling women, hey, it's okay to be assertive, You don't have to feel you're not being feminine when you stick up your hand, you speak out, you are bold. And so that would be intervening on the self side. The self-regulatory aspects follow. So there are multiple points of intervention.
So was social role theory your bridge between gender and sex differences in leadership?
Well, yeah, I was interested early on in looking at social behavior, how does gender operate in social behavior, and simultaneously began to develop a theory. And so then I got, after moving through social influence and altruism and aggression, I thought, well, what else should I meta-analyze? And I thought, well, leadership, because it's an area where there's some obvious sex differences.
Right.
There's something to explain in leadership. So, as opposed to other domains where maybe it was pretty subtle,
Mm-hmm.
it's not subtle in leadership. So I thought, well, I should study leadership. I'd had some interest in it all along. But then I started off by doing a series of 4 meta-analyses on different leader topics. And I got a grant from the National Science Foundation for that work, and so I had to lay it out. So I laid out these 4 domains where I knew there were bodies of research that had not been touched in terms of anybody meta-analyzing them. Nobody understood what the gender phenomena were, and so I thought, well, that would be good to do.
So could you say what the 4 domains were?
Right. They were leadership style.
Mm-hmm.
Do men and women actually enact leadership differently?
Mm-hmm.
And then it was the emergence of leaders from initially leaderless groups. Would men or women emerge, and under what circumstances? And then there was what I called leader evaluation. There were studies in which, it's really the prejudice piece. There's a body of experimental research in which men and women, or women, are described as leaders, or maybe leadership is enacted. But the leadership is held constant. Absolutely. They just change the sex.
Okay.
And so then if women are not as well received doing exactly the same thing or with exactly the same qualifications, you would call that prejudice. And so there was that body of research. And then there was a body of research, we called it leader effectiveness, where it was largely on managers. And so there had been some evaluative measures of managers, usually in, field studies of some sort. So the leadership is not controlled, they're just doing whatever they're doing, but we looked for studies in which they're basically in the same role, like they're all school superintendents or something. And then you could see how they're evaluated.
So the first article that I found where you published on leadership was titled Leadership Style and Role Differentiation as Determinants of Group Effectiveness, Journal of Personality, 1970. There's a big gap where I couldn't find anything. Again, you were mostly publishing on gender, and
Right, yeah.
I copied out some of the titles, some of which we've already talked about.
Yeah, that early one was just sort of a one-off kind of study. I was interested in leadership and a little bit, but then I didn't follow that up very directly until 1990, I think.
Yeah, you were publishing on things like gender and helping behavior, gender aggressive behavior,
right.
gender social influence, and so looking for here we go, 1990.
Mm-hmm.
While you were still at Purdue, but I want to back up before that because you mentioned your National Science Foundation grant, and I assume you've had many.
A number, yeah.
But you had one in particular while you were at Purdue, a major National Science Foundation grant to carry out meta-analysis of gender and leadership.
Right.
And you just talked about the 4 categories.
That was the 4.
Okay, Blair Johnson became one of your doctoral students.
Yes, he was very important there.
Well, he told me that he read the pink sheets, which for the benefit of people who don't know what they are, and I don't know if they're even pink anymore, those are the grant referees reports.
Yeah.
And he said that, which describes your proposed research in glowing terms as impressive on the cutting edge. He said he was just blown away by reading these things. So, as you think back, did the awarding of that National Science Foundation grant and those comments by your peers on the pink sheets indicate how far you'd come in moving gender into the mainstream of social psychology.
Well, yeah, that was great that I got
Because-
support for it.
Because when you started, it was sort of out on the edge somewhere.
Yeah, and so that was great that I got that support. And had I not, I don't know if I would have gone forward to do those projects, and then I don't know if I ever would have gone forward to do anything else on leadership. So it was pretty critical that I got it. Yeah. Yeah, and then of course if you get it, you sort of have to deliver it too. It's not just some idea that you have.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was really
Right.
struck by the fact that, of course, I was no way I would have access to that information. So,
Yeah.
but he shared
Yeah,
me his
it did.
memory.
It did. I think because meta-analysis was kind of new, and it had some scope that I saw these 4 projects. So it was just the right thing at the right time, I think.
But I mean, it also just struck me by the fact that this, because you were still dealing with gender.
Yeah.
But here you got major National Science Foundation.
Yeah.
Funding with glowing reports.
Right.
From
I
these
think
referees.
yeah. There wasn't much resistance. It wasn't. Gender wasn't the critical topic in the discipline, but it had moved up quite a lot by then. The amount, and I know this from this more recent project where we looked at gender work over time, and it had increased a whole lot, the amount of work on gender in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Yeah.
So in the 1980s, you were a social psychologist with a tremendous reputation in the study of attitudes, gender and sex roles. And from doing some reading and talking to some of your colleagues, psychologists who studied leadership were more likely to be working in industrial or organizational psychology
Right.
than social psychology.
Uh-huh.
So when you began to move your own research agenda in the direction of leadership, did you get any pushback from colleagues who worked in other areas and saying,
Not really.
what are you doing here? Stepping on my toes or anything like that?
Actually not. The first of those meta-analytic projects was on leadership style, and leadership style was somewhat declining in industrial organizational psychology, because the classic ways of looking at leadership style had been critiqued quite a lot, and so we were actually looking at that classic literature. So for them, it was they weren't too excited because there was quite a lot of critique of those kinds of measures, but yet the findings were quite interesting that we came out with. And, I sort of only gradually became associated with what we call IO psychology. So I didn't sort of industrial organizational. I didn't march in and say, here I am. But I was then a few times invited to one of their conferences to be part of a panel. So at first I thought, well, should I go there? Why would I go there? And I remember one of my colleagues who was an IO said, well, Alice, the people who study leadership are in IO. Why wouldn't you go? And I thought, that's true. I will go. So then I went, and they were very nice. They seemed quite welcoming. And eventually I joined their division of the American Psychological Association, their society, and eventually then I became a fellow of their society eventually. Then they even gave me a prize a few years ago. So I found them open-minded and welcoming. Yeah.
So in 1990, while you were still at Purdue, you published Gender and Leadership Style and Meta-Analysis. Appeared in Psychological Bulletin. Co-author Blair Johnson, and this was one of the 4 areas that you identified with that National Science Foundation grant. Why did you begin your examination of leadership with a meta-analysis?
Well, because that was one of the questions that people disagreed about. It was so interesting that the scientists, they were in industrial organizational psychology, were saying, well, there's no difference in leadership. There's no sex difference. We know that. And they would cite a few studies, maybe I'll cite 3 or 4 studies that didn't get any difference. And then there were popular writers who were mainly like management consultants, people who were out there in the trenches, women, who were writing these books about the female style. And they were, they sold a lot of books, as a matter of fact. And so, they had sort of been there and observed, and, they had all these qualitative stories to tell and examples, quite compelling in a way. But then the experts said, that's ridiculous. But they would cite 3 or 4 studies, and that was ridiculous because I had the sense that we're probably hundreds of studies.
Yeah.
And so that was the idea, to actually go out and find the studies and to get it, because just to say there's no difference based on the citing of 3 or 4 studies is not responsible in a scientific sense. So I thought the answer would be more complex than either story, either the trade books or the scientists. And it was sort of, politically correct to say there's no sex difference. So the scientists were saying that. In some circles it was politically correct at any rate. So it struck me as ever so intriguing to go actually find the studies and see whether there were differences.
And were there?
Mildly so, and the biggest one was the stereotypic one, which the trade writers were talking about. The women were more participative and collaborative. And then the others, that men might be more like task-oriented or instrumental leadership, but women more people-oriented in some sense. That was the other part that you could look at in terms of lots of literature. And that was less true when you moved into real managerial roles as opposed to more lab studies where you took students. And there we argued the managerial role was pretty powerful to get you to do it a certain way.
Right.
And you probably have to do both of those things as a manager. But that the participatory part is a little more discretionary.
But when you did the meta-analysis, did you find anything in the way of what you consider to be fundamental differences?
Well,
or did you identify differences in which, while a woman may have inclined in a particular direction, that some men did that too? And
sure,
men were inclined in a direction, but some women did that too.
Right. But they're virtually all psychological sex differences are that way. They're overlapping distributions. But nonetheless, you may find average differences, and those average differences tend to be represented stereotypically. So it was pretty interesting because we got these relatively modest differences, but they did. The one that was overriding the different contexts was this participative directive. Men more top-down, women more collaborative. And that, is it fundamental? Well, that's difficult to say. It depends on how you interpret it. So it may be that women are kind of forced into it because they are often not as welcome as leaders. And so the way to make people comfortable is to give them some counterpower in the situation and talk to them and, form bonds with them to win their confidence in a sense. So, the interpretation is not inherent in the phenomenon. So, but we did see something there, yeah.
So once you know that, what does that say for, say, women who want to become leaders or programs that train leaders?
Well, it's a little complicated. We also found out that when you go to extremely male-dominated environments like the military, that tends to be less so that women are collaborative, and it's probably because there's one way, the military way. Thank you very much.
That was my experience.
Yeah, and it's the mode. That
right.
You're the officer, and people don't question your authority, and so even for the women that may have been true. So I think that in view of other things that we know now about backlash, that in fact it should be recommended to women that they are authoritative but collaborative, because it may make people more comfortable with their authority, and they may indeed have to win them over in a sense. And so that's not true in all settings, but I think that to say that we do see this difference, and that it may be more other information suggests that it may be more effective for women to add those qualities to their leadership.
I understand from your co-author Blair Johnson that the two of you discovered that the amount of work required to carry out the meta-analysis was much larger than you originally anticipated.
And he produced a computer program that did the calculations, the first such program, and that was an immense help to us.
He said that when you applied for renewal of the National Science Foundation grant, that you really didn't have much to show for it, and yet NSF renewed.
Yeah.
So what did that tell you about the research path you were on? That you were able to
well,
get
they
that
do
renewal?
take a long time. Yeah.
I mean, the fact that they were willing to renew without much in the way of...
publication.
Yeah,
there was no publication yet, I guess. And so, that was good.
I mean, I will note that Gender and Leadership Style has demonstrated significant ongoing staying power. It's been reprinted 5 different times between 1992 and 2004.
Yes.
Yours ranks 4th on your citation index. I mean, it's really been amazing.
Yeah, it has been successful in that way.
Blair Johnson earned his PhD from Purdue in 1988, and he's presently a professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut.
Right.
This, I think, is another example of you launching the career, or helping to launch the career of one of your students.
He's done great. He's very productive.
He had a very charming thing to say about this article. It's number 1 on his citation index.
It is. I've seen that.
And so he said that gender and leadership, he said, is like money in the bank. It keeps on making interest.
Right, that's true.
So I thought that would. I will also add that he told me that your mentoring of him really put him in a position to have a satisfying career, and that he feels as though every time he helps one of his students, he's paying you back.
Oh, that's nice.
So
that's
that
really,
was
very nice.
I asked for his permission to pass that along. So
yeah, he's been very successful, and he was a very, very good graduate student. Yeah.
And so then you then published a meta-analysis in each of the other 3 areas.
Yes. Eventually, they took quite a while to get all 4 of them out.
I wanted to see if I can switch from leadership style to access to leadership. And you have written about what people call the glass ceiling. I don't know if that's a scientific term, but it's one that's descriptive. And have argued that this is not a good description of the situation women face as they seek to move up the career ladder. And you've described the glass ceiling as a metaphor as being, I'm quoting you, profoundly misleading, because it fails to capture the phenomenon of women's actual careers.
Right.
So thinking in terms of access to leadership, can you explain why the glass ceiling metaphor is profoundly misleading?
Well, it suggests there's absolute barriers, that's very, very difficult to get beyond. And that's not the case with the barriers. There are challenges, but they're more permeable than would be suggested by the notion of a firm barrier. But that it's the same for women as men is not the case. And so the notion of a labyrinth, the men might have more of a straight road, and that women might have more challenges of various sorts, which, maybe with thought and a bit of luck and perseverance can be overcome, so that women can move to their career goals successfully. So it's a more accurate metaphor because, we have women, and we haven't had a female president, we have, secretaries of state, and we have some CEOs in Fortune 500, but many women leading many organizations. So it isn't as if it's not possible. It certainly is. Yeah, and then furthermore, the glass ceiling, to me, it's just a metaphor, so they're ambiguous, but that women don't see it until they hit their heads on it or something, but that implies they don't understand the phenomena, and I think women are able to understand that there are challenges that they face. So it's sort of a know-nothing metaphor, too. Yeah.
Do you, again, looking back over your long career as a scholar, do you see the culture of access to leadership changing in a positive direction?
Yes, somewhat. Yeah, we do see over time more women in leadership roles for sure. It's slow progress, as in the Congress, but it nevertheless is moving upward in most all leadership roles. And so is the culture changing? Yes, and that's one of my later projects, another meta-analysis on the leader stereotype. So we have a way of thinking about leadership, and so leaders should epitomize it. And so that is culturally masculine, that leaders take charge and, are assertive and know what they're doing and tell people what to do. But we showed across 3 different types of research, 3 different research paradigms, that image of leadership is gravitated toward androgyny. It's still masculine, but it's not so extremely so. So people are now expecting leadership to have more, to embody more social skills, interpersonal skills of working closely with people and, bringing them on board, and that leaders are supposed to encourage followers and motivate them and be more teachers and coaches of them, rather than just telling them what to do and, scolding them when they're not doing it or something. So that has changed in the culture in many contexts. So it's less extremely masculine.
So if the culture of androgyny, the culture of leadership is a little bit more androgynous than it was, is that because women who want to become leaders are acting more like stereotypical men, or because there's been give on both sides and we're redefining what it takes to be a leader?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we don't entirely know why it's changed. Your typical organizational theorist gives an explanation that has nothing to do with gender. It's the nature of organizations, that organizations are flatter structures, where leaders are not just up here, sort of determining things. It's very complex instead. If you think of like building cars or something, you have all kinds of different expertise brought together. It's very international, it's very complex, and so the leader or the CEO has to be so engaged in so many ways to do a good job that it does take a lot of social skill as well as other kinds of skills. And then a lot of organizations are pretty flat, and so people have to engage other people pretty directly, even though they're managers and vice presidents or whatever. So your typical organizational expert says that. Then you could say, well, we have so many more women. 39% of all managers are now women in the U.S., and that maybe women did it differently, and that redefined leadership. And that may be true to some extent, but I don't know of any proof of that. That women have to do it like men is a misconception that some women have, because we know that if women act like men, nobody likes them, and they get into all kinds of trouble with people. And so that's not typically the phenomenon. Most women are pretty smart, and they learn that if they operate in a more androgynous repertoire, that they can be more successful. They shouldn't be super feminine. That doesn't usually work, because that seed is weak. But they're kind of, I think, pushed into a more androgynous behavioral repertoire because people react to them better. But that would redefine leadership, right, if they're doing that. So there may be some of that, but we don't have the kind of research that's sorted that out. would be a difficult question to address empirically, I think.
In 2007, you co-published with Linda Carley a book titled Through the Labyrinth, The Truth
Right.
About How Women Become Leaders, which I would describe, I guess, as more for a general readership than most of your previous work.
Yes, that's what we...
It's
how we
published
wrote
in
it.
the Leadership for Common Good series of the Center for Public Leadership, the John F. Kennedy School of
Yeah.
Government, Harvard University.
Yes.
And of course, Harvard's got the MBA program there. What made you decide to do that?
Well, I
Sort of
felt...
breaks the mold of what you've done for...
Yeah, I
for-
felt there was all that work on leadership and there was a huge amount of public interest.
Mhm.
And so to bring it together and make it accessible, it's kind of a crossover book rather than truly a trade book, because most of the trade books on leadership are very qualitative, you know, they're very full of examples and experiences. But we wanted to make the research accessible because we think it's very informative. And so we did, you know. I think it's moderately successful. It's sold pretty well. But it's not, you know, a big-time trade book.
So you don't have a yacht called the Labyrinth or anything?
No, we don't.
No?
Yeah, it sold about 17,000 copies. So, you know, it is widely used in courses too. Say people have a course on gender and leadership, or even a course on leadership. You know, these leadership programs, or sometimes in business schools or undergraduate courses. So it's you know, academic enough that professors would take it who are concerned that, you know, students know that there's research. But then it is, you know, it's read by out there, some by managers and other people.
So we might imagine for a moment that somebody will read this transcript or listen to this recording who is not familiar with your body of work and maybe has not read this book. So could you explain what the Labyrinth represents?
Well, it does represent women's careers in a sense, and the challenges. And so the book does explain the challenges. You know, that we do have chapters on like the work-family issues, the work-life issues, and then as part of the challenges, and then the whole business about the stereotyping and how that affects how people react to women and men, and the backlash phenomenon, and then the leadership style piece, how women and men do it and whether it makes a difference. So we explain all these challenges that make up the labyrinth, and we use it, you know, to some extent as an integrating device, you know, through, we refer to the labyrinth, well, here's this challenge, and well, that's just part of the labyrinth, you know. So it helped us to have a way of integrating the pieces of the book, and I hope it helps people in their understanding, because I think metaphors are important because they give people something to grasp mentally, and then they can add other phenomena to it, you know, in their thinking. That's not unreasonable that there is that backlash, given that the whole thing is a labyrinth anyway, you know, or that women do have these challenges. Yeah, and so, yeah, I thought it was helpful.
So what did you conclude was the truth about how women become leaders?
Oh, well, that's not something you could summarize in a sentence or two.
What would you say are the salient points that might prompt somebody to, their next step would be to the library to pick up the book?
Yeah, well, I think what's distinctive, I mean, like the work-family issues, a lot of social scientists discuss that. That's not very distinctive. The distinctive aspects are that we knew a lot about leadership style and a lot about the kind of prejudice aspects, and so how that all fits together. You know, women's style, it sort of addresses the potential for prejudice, and the conditions under which backlash occurs, and you know, to understand this level of phenomena, I think helps people actually behaviorally if they can, and then also helping people understand the nature of leadership. It does demand directiveness and some degree of assertiveness or whatever. So that to help women to understand that probably the androgynous route is their best route, and that does not mean acting like a man, but it does not mean crying at work and using some stereotypic soft feminine maneuvers. So to help people understand those things and to anticipate that they may get negative reactions of various sorts, and particularly from men in some contexts. And so it's not like some shock, or you shouldn't sort of ignore it. You should understand that it's there, and it's not because of me, it's because as an individual that I'm failing here necessarily, it's because of the broader phenomenon of gender in society. So to take some of the onus off the individual woman as she understands that the process is broader than herself. Yeah.
And that's important for women to know if they have those
I think so, because otherwise if you're in a situation where there have been few women and you have this leadership role and you sort of don't have that much legitimacy with some audiences, maybe particularly the men, to understand that is a situation that's pretty challenging, actually. And why is it challenging? And then when you get this backlash or some undermining or whatever, not necessarily to think, well, I can't do this, I'm failing here because I'm just not good enough. It might be that it's that you're a breakthrough woman, and this is part of what happens. But hang in there, because you're in a labyrinth, that if you stick in the labyrinth, you're going to get to go. That's the other part. Persistence is a labyrinth message. You always get to the center of the labyrinth, if you work at it.
We have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to ask you a few sort of big picture questions. But you mentioned the military a couple of times, and that, of course, does come into play when we talk about leadership. And I'll preface this in truth in advertising that I was a military officer in a former life for a few years in the early 1970s for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I found the military at that time to be one of the most colorblind organizations that I'd ever been affiliated with. In other words, it didn't matter what color you were. And women were just entering the officer corps and line units.
Yeah.
And we tended to find that they were more or less accepted if they didn't try to act, if they didn't become stereotypes of men. If they were just themselves, they were fine. So, but here's my question. We've now reached a point decades later where the military is seriously talking about removing the final bar to women in the officer corps, which is let them go into combat.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we might say that they're removing barriers. On the other hand, we have a horrible problem with sexual assault in the military.
Oh, I know.
How do you assess that as a leadership situation? And I'm thinking, is it really? I don't want to lead the witness here. How do you feel as a scholar about removing that final barrier and letting the woman strap on the M16 and go into combat?
Oh, I think the barrier should be removed. It won't be all women who are going to choose that type of military service.
And not all men would either. So
it's going to be highly selective. And so those women who do it, I think, are probably quite qualified. There is one of the issues is the physical differential. Men are bigger and stronger, and so there has to be some reasonable accommodation. They have them carrying huge amounts on their backs. The men are ruining their spines doing it.
That's true.
And so they need to be that whole thing needs to be changed. But there needs to be some accommodation. But the women, I think, can be fine. And so it should be removed. The sexual assault question, I think, is a failure of military leadership. Absolutely. They're not responsible. And so, the horror stories come out where, the woman can be assaulted by her officer, and then then if she tries to go to someone else, they won't listen. I mean, so this is just a failure of responsible leadership on the part of the military. And I think the only solution is to do what they are refusing to do, which is to have outside legal, redress where they do not have to go to the line of command, because the line of command is often supporting it's their buddy, who did this. And so they're just dismissing the women's complaint. So that's a total failure of responsible leadership. And I don't know if they can fix it. I do not think they can fix it. And therefore they should agree to what's being proposed by Senator Gillibrand and others in our Congress, which is that the women will have these other people outside of the line of command who will hear their complaints and investigate it. Because I think the military has shown that they cannot do it. They just cannot handle that.
Okay. I'm going to ask you some general questions and end up with a sort of catch-all, but as you look back on your career, is there anything you'd do over if you could have a do-over?
Oh, lots of things.
For example?
Oh, I don't know. They're always, it's worked out well, but then I think back on it, I remember a lot of bumbling aspects. And so I think, well, if I hadn't been bumbling, but then that it worked out well, so I have to say that probably the balance was that I was more competent than bumbling, So, yeah. Sometimes there were some controversies I entered into. I thought I could have handled it better. There was one in attitudes research that I was part of, and with Blair, actually, meta-analysis we did that ended up being very controversial. I thought maybe I could have been more clever in handling that. There were some relationships with people that I thought I could have handled more skillfully. In some cases with some graduate students. Maybe I was too demanding in a sense for them, for that particular person. And then, I think I ended up being kind of lucky in what I pursued when I pursued it, and so I wouldn't change that, but it wasn't that I did it knowingly. Like studying gender when it was unfashionable meant that I could do work that then was regarded as, sort of leading things later on and became influential. So that was actually good, but I didn't know how it would work out. Yeah, so there were, this on small things, and some particular projects or research topics I pursued. Maybe I published an article, but it wasn't that effective, or that wasn't a very good route or whatever. But on balance, I guess I have to be happy with it.
So, as you look back at your career, what satisfies you the most?
Oh. Well, I suppose the work on gender is more obviously gratifying. The work on attitudes I'm proud of, because I think we made a difference to that area of study in social psychology, and it was worthwhile, and I still love that area of study. But then the work on gender, because it has more of a public audience, I think that's been gratifying, and I hope to build on that further. And also it's connected me more broadly with outside of this small community of social psychologists, because other people are interested in gender. So I've connected with people in other social science fields, and like this leadership organization, which is very interdisciplinary and all. And so I enjoy that. So it's intellectually stimulating to go out and hear what people, how they do things when they're not doing it as social psychologists do it, and what did they find out, and how does that fit with what I know, So I like the work on gender a lot for the breadth
Mm-hmm.
and the potential to address social issues and gender equality.
Do you consider yourself to be a work in progress? What would you still like to accomplish?
Well, the main issue that I'm still very engaged in is a debate with the evolutionary psychologist about the nature of sex differences.
Mm-hmm.
Because they see most aspects of them as following from dispositions that are built in, back there early in human evolution, and that we're stuck with our Stone Age minds, and that it all gets played out all the time. And so I and Wendy, who works with me in this area, see it much more under the control of roles, which do reflect, some fundamental
Mm-hmm.
differences between men and women. But it's not that all these psychological traits got built in. Some, kind of tendencies in terms of temperament, but not at the level that they see them built in, which is very specific, like what kinds of mates we select and all that. So it's the debate with the evolutionary psychologists where we've been actually the main critical voice that's known to psychologists. And so we need to build on what we've already written, and then to get it out there again. And then we hope to write a book. Exactly the nature of that book is still somewhat something we debate, but to get a book out there, probably one of those intellectual books accessible to the public, so that they could have our framework to interpret sex differences rather than the evolutionary one, which actually has gotten out there quite a lot into public discourse.
I don't want this question to sound morbid because you're obviously still engaged in an active career, but just based on where you are now in your career trajectory, what would you like your legacy to be? What do you want to be remembered for as a scholar?
Remembered for, well.
And we can't put the things you haven't done yet on the list.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the things I've done, it'd be nice if all of them remembered, but, some of them are not important. But the work on gender, the work on attitudes, I think has gotten quite a lot of recognition, and I've been gratified by that. That will fade. It has faded, but some. The work on gender, in terms of giving a broad framework for understanding gender, which was still a work in progress. That's still a work in progress. That is, I think, important. The leadership piece, too, I think is very important. So, it'd be great to have that, have some enduring quality.
One more question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't?
Oh.
Or anything that I haven't given you a chance to say?
You've done very well. I kind of covered it, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Then, the recording's still on behalf of myself and the International Leadership Association and Tobias Center. Thank you very much for being kind enough to sit with me for about 4 hours on 2 different days. So thank you. And
Thank you.